all of you on day 2 of our Indology Festival, THT's annual week-long online event. Through the course of this week, 12 eminent 12 eminent speakers, scholars, and authors will be coming together on a common platform to talk about Wanderers and Witnesses, Travelers' Tales of India, the theme for our Indology Festival this year. They say, well begun is half done. We began well yesterday by looking at the motivations and impressions of Megasthenes and Fahian, two of the earliest travelers to our subcontinent, who also left behind fairly detailed accounts of their experience here. Through their narratives, written with awe, pragmatism, and detail, we got a rich glimpse of the army, culture, society, educational systems, and cultural practices of historic India, which was further elaborated upon by our two eminent speakers yesterday, Professor R. Troutman and Dr. Venus Jain, in their talks. Moving forward, let us look at two more inspiring and insightful travelers in the same tradition, Biruni and Xuanzang. The journeys of both these travelers were not just physical, but deeply intellectual and spiritual. Biruni, a 11th century Persian polymath, approached India with the mindset of a scientist and sensitivity of a cultural observer. His account, known as Kitabul Hind, is considered to be one of the earliest and finest examples of cross-cultural scholarship, where he gives us a nuanced understanding of Indian society, astronomy, maths, and religious practices. Xuanzang, a 7th century Chinese monk, undertook this perilous journey to India looking for sacred Buddhist texts and also to acquire a deep understanding of the religion of Buddhism. His detailed accounts about Indian society, culture, religious practices, and education systems, especially in and around Nalanda, where he lived for most of his time here, are considered to be invaluable historical records even today. Both these travelers approached India with intellectual humility and cultural curiosity. They did not look at India as a mere land. They did not just see it. They studied it, they engaged with it, and tried to understand it on its own terms. As we try to begin our session for day 2, let us reflect upon the spirit of these two travelers, open-minded, inquisitive, and with a deep understanding and respect for the culture that they encountered here. Inspired by these narratives, we also should try to look beyond the surface and explore the deep human connect that exists across borders and through centuries. Before we move on to the main event today, let me give you a brief introduction about Tamil Heritage Trust, which is our organization, especially for the benefit of those who've joined us for the first time today. Tamil Heritage Trust, or Tamil Paramparya Arakattalai, is a voluntary organization started by a group of like-minded people almost 15 years back, with the explicit objective of understanding, appreciating, disseminating, and celebrating information related to India's rich history and heritage, not just for the scholarly and academic, but for the average enthusiastic public as well. Towards this end, THT conducts several programs throughout the year. Chief amongst these are our talks and seminars. Every month, we have what is called as the THT Monthly Talk Series on the first Saturday. This is an English online talk. Then in December, we have an in-person 2-day concert, which is called the Pechu Kacheri or the Oratory Concert, which is meant to collaborate and coincide with the Margari Isai Kacheris of Chennai. The third scholarly initiative of ours is the Indology Festival, and as we are all aware, we are on the second day of this event. Apart from our talks and seminars, THT also conducts various workshops and classroom sessions. We have one-day workshops called How to See a Temple, How to See a Museum, etc., which are conducted in 2 sessions. The forenoon session has a series of lectures, and the afternoon session has a practical site visit. Anybody can register and participate in these workshops. On and off, we also conduct classroom sessions on a variety of topics like Pallava Grantham script, ancient Indian astronomy, ancient Indian mathematics, etc. Alamar Away is another initiative of ours targeting the school teachers of Tamil Nadu. Over a series of weekend lectures, aspects of Indian history and heritage are discussed, the idea being that the teachers take it back to their students, thus spreading awareness. Another initiative of ours is called the docent training, where a training is given to prepare docents to present historical sites and heritage monuments in a professional manner to the enthusiastic audience. We just finished version 2 of this training earlier this year, and registrations for version 3 will commence soon. Site Seminar is another initiative of ours, which is largely in-house, meant for our own self-enhancement and self-education. Zeroing upon a particular site in India, our volunteers study the same in detail over several weeks and disseminate the same through several in-house seminars. Then, armed with all this knowledge, we visit the particular site and experience it in its totality. Apart from this, THT has also instituted 2 important awards meant for individual contributions. The first such award is named after our founder and called the THT Professor S. Swaminathan Heritage Award. This is given for individual contributions in the field of Indian history and heritage. Call for nominations for this award will begin next month. The second award given by us is called V. Venkaiah Epigraphy Award. Named after V. Venkaiah, the first official Indian epigraphist, this award has been instituted by Sunita Madhavan, his great-granddaughter. THT has been entrusted with the responsibility of administering this award. We have a dedicated YouTube channel. You can find links to all our past talks here, right down to today's talks. Kindly subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to receive notifications of our future events. These are our social media handles, and this is our mailing address. You can mail us here to join our mailing list or to contribute and join our activities in any way in a voluntary capacity. As I already mentioned, we are a voluntary organization and we do not have any dedicated financial backing. So any kind of contributions are welcome and will be appreciated. You may use this QR code and address to contribute generously. That, in a nutshell, was about THT. Now, as I already mentioned, we have 2 talks today lined up talking about Biruni and Xuanzang. The first talk for the day is given by Riddhi Joshi, an assistant professor of history at KJ Somaiya College of Arts, Mumbai. She will be talking about Biruni and his travels in her talk titled Biruni's Lens, India Through the Eyes of a 11th Century Explorer. The second talk for the day will be given by Max Deeg, and he'll be talking about Xuanzang and his travels. Now, before we commence on Riddhi's talk, here's a brief abstract of her talk. Biruni was a celebrated scholar from the 11th century in Central Asia who accompanied Muhammad of Ghazni to India. Biruni approached India with deep curiosity and scientific rigor and documented his observations in a work titled Kitab-e-Hind. In her talk, Ms. Joshi will be exploring how Biruni observed and recorded Indian customs, languages, religious ideas, and social systems. She attempts to trace the textures of his writing, what he noticed, and how he described a land, both unfamiliar and fascinating, and also understand how a traveler from Central Asia engaged with India's intellectual landscape. By delving deeper into Biruni's perspective, Ms. Joshi will highlight the cross-cultural developments and social structures of 11th century India with valuable insights. A little bit about the speaker. An assistant professor of history at the KJ Somaya College of Arts and Commerce, Mumbai, and a visiting faculty for history in the School of Law at Narsi Monji Institute of Management Studies, Riddhi G. Joshi regularly lectures on archaeology and history and conducts culinary walks, study and heritage tours for colleges as well as the general public. Associated with the India Study Center, Institution Trust, Mumbai, Riddhi has presented papers at several national and international conferences. She has also been a research associate on several heritage projects in association with national and international institutions. Riddhi also holds a Visharat in Hindustani classical music, which she also teaches. Believe me, she also sings amazingly well, and I've heard her. With this, I invite Riddhi to take over the screen and deliver her talk.
Thank you, ma'am. Good evening, everyone. At the outset, I would first like to thank the THT, Badri sir, Gauri ma'am, Gopu sir, and everybody at THT. It's like coming back home and coming back with all the memories of the 2024 site seminar, Maharashtra. So I got to interact with everybody there, and then coming back to Tamil Nadu in September. So it is like just coming back home for me when it's THT. So thank you so much. And I'll start with Biruni. Okay. So today we are going to talk about Biruni, who is the 11th century explorer who came to India. Now he came to India not as a wanderer, not as an explorer, but as a completely different individual who was accompanying an invader. But his view of looking towards India is completely different from what we see in case of all the other travelers. And we, at the outset, when we say that he accompanied an invader, we might feel that, he might have a completely different view of India being an antagonist or India being an enemy area. But it is not like that. He is describing a land in a completely different fashion, a land which is known to him, yet unknown and fascinating at the same time. So Biruni is what we popularly know him as. However, his original name was Abu al-Rehan al-Biruni. His real name at birth was Abu al-Rehan, and he was born on the 4th of September in the 10th century, 973 AD. This corresponds to the Hijri year of the 3rd Dhul Hijjah, 362 Hijri. So he was born in this area called as Kayat, which comes under the Chorasmian region. Now, Chorasmian region was originally feudatories of the Sassanids, and later on they changed and became feudatories of several others and then became an independent territory on their own. So this originally comes under present-day Uzbekistan. We don't know much about his childhood. All that we know about him is that he was orphaned at a very young age. He himself, in his biography, biographical poem, we know about him saying that he does not know who his father is, nor he knows who his grandfather is. So he doesn't know about his origin. So we know that he was orphaned at a very young age. He was trained in the court of Khwarizm Shah. So we'll go into details of where this area Khwarizm is shortly. But this province comes into present-day Uzbekistan. So he got the title as Biruni. Now, Berun by itself means outside or external. So since he was born in this area, which was outside or external region of Khwarizm, that is what gained him the title as Biruni. Otherwise, his contemporaries all call him Abu al-Rehan. None of them call him al-Biruni. But the people who are outsiders, they call him al-Biruni because he is living in the external region. In his childhood, he met a very great scholar, which actually decided his destiny for him in the later period. So he was given great patronage, and we know that he was in the court of the Afrigid dynasty at that time. He, at his very young age, got into contact with several scholars. So most of them, if we talk about in that time, were mathematicians. To be very precise, the great mathematician who inspired him at that age was Abu Nasr Mansur Ibn Ali Ibn Iraq. For ease of understanding, his name is Abu Nasr Mansur. So he became the first teacher of Al-Biruni. He was a renowned mathematician and a very, very great astronomer of his own time.
Sorry, Riddhi, we lost your video.
Yes, sir, because it was giving me a message of that my bandwidth is low because it has started raining over here.
Okay, please go ahead. Please
I just stopped the video.
Sure. Sorry, please.
Yeah, I'll continue. So he was trained by Abu Nasr Mansur, who was a great mathematician and an astronomer himself. So when Mansur was writing theorems of the signs of plane and spherical triangles, that is when from childhood itself we know that Biruni was really inspired by him. Apart from that, Biruni from his childhood had this curiosity into him. So we know that he himself talks about this, that when he was staying in Khwarazm, at that time there were a lot of Greeks who used to come for trade. And he used to inquire the Greeks that, what is this commodity? What is it called in the Greek language? How much quantity are you selling? Where do you get it in your area? So he used to collect all of these facts and write about it. He really liked to learn different languages. So he just did not stop at the language that he knew. But he did not stop at Arabic just itself, but he also learns Greek. So he gets to know the equivalents of every commodity in Greek as well as Arabic. He continues to learn many other languages. So he also learns Persian, he learns the Syriac language, and later we'll also see how he learned Sanskrit as well. From his very young age, we also know that he was responsible, along with his teacher, to study an early Indian text on astronomy called the Sindh Hind. Now, Sindh Hind was something which you called as a Zij. Zij is an astronomical handbook which has a lot of tables, and it is used to calculate the celestial positions of the different planets. So he and his teacher had studied them. But initially, Mansur himself has written a lot of treatises on mathematics and astronomy, but later on he credits Al-Biruni equally for the writing of all these books. So originally Biruni starts as his student, but later on goes on to become his colleague also. We also know that Al-Biruni, apart from liking languages, he also, and obviously mathematics and astronomy, he also liked to understand and observe different eclipses in the sky. And he wanted to look beyond the Islamic understanding of all these astronomical events. He also wanted to learn things like calendric systems in different parts of the world. So he got to know this from a very young age, that there are other things apart from the Islamic way of looking at astronomical events because of his teacher. And then he had this curiosity in him from a very young age to understand that what is happening in the civilizations beyond him. These are three very interesting illustrations done in the books of Al-Biruni himself. This is his life before he actually comes to India. Why I'm talking more about this? Because this is something that will build up how he understood India later on. So by this time, he already knew about India. He knew about how Indians were very well versed with mathematics and astronomy. With his shared understanding of whatever he knew about the Islamic way of looking at things, the Indian way of looking at things, and the Greek way of looking at things, he brings everything together and writes three very interesting books. The first one is the Kitab al-Tahfim. So in this book, he talks in great details about the different phases of the moon and how it looks because of the position of the sun. So this is a very interesting diagram that he shows. And a lot of us have seen this in our school science textbooks. But you can see that the oldest one, or rather the very old one, is already drawn by Al-Biruni in his book called the Kitab al-Tahfim. There's another very interesting book that he writes, which is the Kitab al-Athar al-Baqiya and al-Quran al-Kahliyan. So this book talks about all the other astronomical and another interesting aspect, which is called as the geodesy, wherein he will decide the distances of different astronomical objects on the basis of different mathematical calculations. So in this book, he talks about the different 4 cardinal directions of Iran, and he describes it in the map. So this again, he's using a circle, if you observe. So he is very well aware of this phenomenon that the earth is spherical. By the age of 21 or 22, he makes a very interesting discovery also. So he is also one of the first people who is making a globe. So he makes the first or the initial designs or sketch of a globe. And he was the first one to do it in the case of Central Asia. Now, this is a sketch map on the basis of what he wrote about the world and how he knew that the world would have looked like. So I'll just briefly describe this map for you. Just a minute, I'll start the pointer. So he first measures the earth. Then he goes on to talk about the Qibla, which is the direction of the Mecca, and then the distances of the different cities using different times and astronomy. So this is the world map which comes in this book called the Kitab al-Tahfim li Awa Sina al-Tanjim. This book is written somewhere around in 1029 CE. This map is completely different if you observe. These are some translations also. So here is India that he's talking about. Obviously, he doesn't use the word India. He uses the word Hind. But these are the modern names for all of these places. He talks about China, the Turks. So when he makes all of this map, this is a map which is actually reconstructed. His map is more towards the south direction. This is a north-centric map made on the same description that he has given. This is from the British Library. So he talks about this entire continent. He talks that this entire world is a single land continent and which is encircled by the ocean from all the sides. So this is one single landmass that he's talking about, and it has ocean all around. He does not talk about Africa at all. He talks about China to the east. He also talks that there is something called as the Indian Ocean, which connects the Atlantic Ocean beneath Africa. So he is definitely talking about Africa. And he also talks about certain areas. Obviously, some of his placements are wrong, but he talks about certain areas which have not been talked about in previous maps used by the people from Europe. So even the Ptolemaic maps make certain mistakes, but his map is far more accurate than the ones that is used by them. So this one is reoriented with the north at the top. Now, Al-Biruni's life from here takes a completely different turn, because Al-Biruni was originally, as I said, with the ruler of Khwarazm. But after that, he completely shifts and he goes to other different rulers. And according to the patronage he gets with them, he writes books for them. So he goes to a place which is called as Gurgan, where he writes a very interesting book called as the Chronology of Ancient Nations. So how the different nations came into being, wherein he also brings in this map. This is the world map as shown by Al-Biruni. This was reconstructed in 1912. And according to a Persian scholar, this map is very, very accurate according to the areas that he's talking about. Now, Sudan and all the placements are somewhere or the other missing, but to a great extent, this was far more accurate for that period. He gives old names or the names used in that period for all those places. He's talking about Europe, he's talking about Asia, he's talking about North Africa, and all the names that he's using are the names that were used for that time. So if you observe some of the places which he is naming over here, you can see Fars over here. So when he says Fars, he is talking about the region of Persia. He's talking about Hind, which is India. He's also talking about Tibet. He's talking about the Turkish rule over here, the Turks. He's talking about Russia, which is Russia. He's talking about France, which is today's France. So in this way, he's talking about a lot of regions which exist in the map even today. A great turning point comes to his life somewhere around 1017. So before this, as I said, Al-Biruni has changed his centers from one place to another. He has roamed the entire empire with different rulers. And wherever he gets patronage, he is writing books for them. He is observing the different astronomical events. He is observing eclipses. He is writing about that. And then after going around everywhere, he comes back to Khwarazm. Now this is Khwarazm in the map. Now, when he is back over here in 1017, the people in Khwarazm get together and they rebel against the Sultan of Khwarazm, who is Abu Abbas al-Mamun. And riots break out in the city. The ruler of Khwarazm is killed. And he is the brother-in-law of a very interesting ruler who is coming from Ghazni. He is the brother-in-law of the ruler of Ghazni. And in order to take revenge, the Mahmud of Ghazna attacks Khwarazm. He takes over the entire area and he brings in a lot of prisoners of war with him. He brings in different categories of people. So he brings in the men who later on become his mercenaries in war. He brings in a lot of scholars also from Khwarazm. And legend has it that the entire line of mercenaries that he got from Khwarazm was so huge that it extended all the way from Khwarazm across Ghazni all the way to Lahore and Multan. That is how huge number of people he brought from there. Al-Biruni was also one of the prisoners that was brought along with him, and he was brought in Ghazni. Now, when he comes to Ghazni, it is very interesting because he is not brought in as a mercenary of war. He is not brought in as a soldier. But because he is a scholar in the court of Khwarazm, when he is brought in, he is brought as a part of a scholarly booty. So Ghazni becomes the new land for Al-Biruni to do his further research. The Mahmud of Ghazni was really fond of poetry, art, and all other forms of art, and also astronomy and sciences. So he does get a lot of patronage from Ghazni to start his research. But not everybody is in his favor, so he does face a lot of problems in his initial years. What we know of is that some of the scholars in his initial years did completely disregard Al-Biruni because A, he was an outsider, and second, he spoke of completely different events and completely different observation of astronomical events. The people who were already in Ghazni, the scholars of that time, associated everything with God and godly nature when it came to the scientific phenomenon. But for Al-Biruni, it was more rational approach, it was more scientific approach, which did not obviously match with the others in the court. So we see this initial conflict that happens. And we also know very well that he did not share a very good relationship with the Mahmud of Ghazni. There are many events that we know of that he does not actually agree with the Mahmud of Ghazni, and we'll talk about that much more in detail later on. However, in spite of them not sharing a good relation, we know that he did enjoy the respect and attention of the Sultan. So originally he was allowed to do whatever he wanted and his intellectual freedom was given to him. And there's a very interesting event that happens in the life of Al-Biruni when he is in the court of Ghazni for the first time. So as I said, earlier many ministers in Ghazni's court did not support him, did not like him. So they asked him to actually undergo a test. They made the Sultan come into a garden of 1,000 trees, and there were 4 doors across the garden and 1 door for each season. And he was asked a question that if you're so good at astronomy and you know what positions the planets take and the stars take and all of that, you will also be good at astrology. So you should predict that which gate will the Sultan take to come out. And Al-Biruni at that time wrote something on a piece of paper and just kept it on the side that this is what he predicts. And then the Sultan was asked to take a particular door and leave. Now the Sultan at that time was on the side of the people and the ministers. So rather than actually taking a door and leaving the room, what he did was he actually built a small hole in the building itself, and through that he exited the building. So now they thought that this was a trick and Al-Biruni will be tricked and he will be, put into shame in front of the court. However, when they opened the sheet where Al-Biruni had written, he actually wrote that the king will go out by none of these 4 doors, but an opening which will be made in the eastern wall for him. Now everybody is very infuriated with all of this, and then he is brought in front of the Sultan. And the Sultan asks that, you will be thrown from here now. So Al-Biruni is thrown from the roof of the building, and he is saved by a mosquito curtain. So Al-Biruni is surviving out of all of these events, and he goes on to say that I had predicted this as well. And he shows this on a sheet of paper, and he says this is all done by the celestial calculations that I've made. Now this event makes him get respect in the eyes of the Sultan. Although he is not very good at astronomy and he does not believe all of these events happen because of godly phenomenon, but he still gets a lot of respect in the eyes of Sultan because of this. And this helps him get the position of the official astrologer of the Sultan. So we many times see him writing that, he does not agree with the phenomenon of astrology, but he is the official astrologer of the Sultan of Ghazni. When he was sitting in Ghazni, he got access to a lot of scholarly work that was done in Sanskrit in that area. Why? Because even before he had reached Ghazni, there were a lot of Indian sources and Indian texts that were available in Ghazni at that time. So he started learning Sanskrit in order to see and understand these sources on their own, in their original. We know that he learned Sanskrit firsthand, and in fact, he also goes on to say that the Sanskrit is a very difficult language. He himself says that, he has taught himself Sanskrit rather than learning it from a teacher, and he has found it extremely difficult. So rather than taking translators in to help, he himself teaches or learns the language. Now, how was India looking like when Ghazni decided to enter into India? And who is this Sultan of Ghazni? So the Sultan of Ghazni is none other than Mahmud of Ghazni, and he led 17 invasions into India. There were different aims for him to come into India. The first and the foremost one being the wealth of India, which attracted him to come. At that time, India was surrounded by a lot of kingdoms. You had the Palas in the east, you had the Gurjara Pratiharas in the west, you had the Hindu Shahis in the north, you had the Rashtrakutas in the central India and down below. You had the Cholas in South India. So there were many, many kingdoms in India. And these are just some of them that I'm mentioning. There were the Kalchuris at that time. There were the Paramaras at that time. So a lot of different dynasties existed. Now, when something like this happens, we understand that there is no central authority. There was a tripartite struggle going on between the Gurjara Pratiharas, the Palas, and the Rashtrakutas to get the control of the central area of Kannauj. When a fragmented authority exists and there is chaos in the entire area, what happens is the centers of power actually do not control or secure any specific area. They are just fighting for more and more territory. This is something to understand, that why did this happen? So the money at that time, the trade was not going at a very good level. We see that the trade majorly goes on in south of India. And this part, the north of India at that time, is suffering in terms of trade. Temples become the centers of wealth. And there is nobody, no central authority to defend all of these temples. So this paved the way of several invasions that happened by the Mahmud of Ghazni, not once, not twice, but 17 times. However, the only good side of it that happened was that it also paved a way for exchange of a different culture, give and take of different ideas, give and take of different forms of knowledge between two different worlds. So we see that the Mahmud of Ghazni first comes into India from the northwest frontier. Initially, his conquests are only towards the Kushana Empire area. So only into this area is what we see. He employs a completely different form of invading India. And in 25 years or around 25 years, he invades India 17 times. He defeats the Hindu Shahis and he launches inside mainland of India, accumulating huge amounts of wealth. So Biruni accompanied him in all of these invasions. But what we also understand at the same time is that Biruni entered in his life much later. By that time, he had already started invading India. So there was a strong presence of the Indian mercenaries of war, the Indian scholarly works, which had already come into Ghazni. So the first-hand account of all of these works was got by Biruni. He started studying all of these works even before he came to India. Just when he was in Ghazni, he started learning of all of this. After that, when he actually accompanies Mahmud to in all of his invasions, we see him writing a book called as the Tehqiq Ma Li Il Hind Min Makula Makbula Fi Al Aqwa Mardula. So this book is also called as the Kitab Al Hind in short. It translates to a critical study of Indian doctrines, whether rationally acceptable or not. So he is not giving you any sort of a conclusion over here. He is not saying that they are rationally acceptable or anything as such. But he is definitely giving you a documentation. He is not writing a travelogue like all the other travelers, but he is documenting everything that he comes across, either by hearing, either by reading the books, or by seeing it himself of India. This book is composed somewhere around in circa 1031. The language is Arabic. It is a very simple Arabic to understand. It is not a very complex Arabic. The entire book is divided into 80 chapters dealing with multiple different subjects. So here we know that he talks about religion, he talks about philosophy, he talks about festivals, astronomy, alchemy, and many, many other things that he comes across in India. We know that he was here in India when the major invasions happened, but he also did not accompany Mahmud in some of the important invasions. And we'll talk about each of these invasions very soon. When he first got hand at the Sanskrit language, he actually first translated his books from Sanskrit into Arabic, and some of his Arabic works into Sanskrit as well. He in Punjab itself met several Indian scholars of that time, especially the Islamic scholars also. So the Ismaili scholars are the ones whom he met in the places of Multan and Sindh. And then he also wrote about what they think of India as a territory and what they know of India as a territory and how are they different from the people belonging to other religions in this area. This is the first thing that he talks about when he starts his book. And I quote, "I shall not produce the argument of our antagonists in order to refute such of them as I believe to be in the wrong." So he's saying that although they are antagonists, I am not going to put ahead their views in that light at all. My book is nothing but a simple historic record of the facts. I shall place before the reader the theories of the Hindus exactly as they are, and I shall mention in connection with them similar theories of Greeks in order to show the relationship existing between them. So he is taking together all the knowledge that he has of India, of Greece, of the this Islamic world, putting it together and then putting it as a documentation of facts. He is not giving his interpretations at all, but he is writing whatever he gets to know. Now, this book is very interesting because after he gives this argument, he goes on to criticize all the other people who has written about India before him. Because he says that this view of them about India is very insufficient and misleading. They're not giving a complete view. At the same time, the facts that they are giving are misleading because they are using the Islamic lens to look at the things of India. They are not just documenting them or seeing it as a first timer. They are using some other lens first and then talking about it. So first hand documentation is given by Biruni for the first time, is what he says. He also talks about all the different faiths that existed in India apart from Hindus. Now, when I say Hindu, it is a term which is not to be understood in terms of religion, but it is to be understood as a geographical term of people living in the province of Al-Hind. That is why Hindus. But he also goes on to talk about Buddhism existing in the country. He also talks about Zoroastrianism existing in the country. He also talks about Judaism at the same time. And obviously Islam. So these are some of the basic questions that he tackles when he talks about the book. The information that he provides always starts with the question. The book itself, the style that he is being following in the entire book is through a question. Now, when I say question, I don't mean the conventional question. So he'll not ask that, how do people in India measure time and understand cosmic cycles? No, this is not a conventional question that he asks, but the question is implied in the content that he is answering. So, for example, if he will ask, he has to talk about the world and the creation, he directly starts with the Indians and understand different doctrines of time. For example, the Kalpas, the Manvantaras, and the Yugas. So he'll directly start with that. So he's not starting with a conventional question, but he's starting with a answer to all of these questions. That when one reads a book about India, these are the questions that one will have in their mind. You know, what are the understanding of time? What is their understanding of soul, rebirth, and liberation? So that is how he starts his book. Every chapter in his book will directly start with the Indian way of looking at things. He'll then go further ahead and compare it with the knowledge that he has of the Greek world. So how do Greeks understand the same phenomenon? After he compares it with the Greek world, he goes further ahead and then talks about the Islamic perspective of the same thing. So in this way, he is first giving an explanation, he is then comparing, and then giving a reflection for the Islamic world to understand all this different phenomena. So for taking the same example which we discussed initially, that how do Hindus measure time? So he will start with that the Hindu doctrine of understanding time is divided into kalpas and yugas. Then he talks about the recreation of the cosmos through the Puranas. So here it is very interesting because he actually is quoting the different Puranas. He in fact even goes on to talk about in detail of the Vishnu Puran. And if you read the book, he is so normally talking about the Vishnu Puran that you will go on to believe that he is a person who knows the Vishnu Puran by heart from page to page. That is how normally he is talking about the Vishnu Puran. Then he'll go on to compare this with the Greek cosmology. So he'll talk about the Pythagorean way of time. He'll talk about the Aristotelian way of time. And then finally, he will reflect it with the Islamic theological debates of time. So in this way, he is using this entire style in all the chapters that he talks about. So it's a heading, starts with a thesis. So you know what to expect in each subject. Then he goes on to answer it. Then talks about it in the Sanskrit tradition, which actually he also gives the Sanskrit quotes at some places, and also the translation of it in Arabic. And then he compares the Indian culture with the Greek and the Islamic culture. At a lot of places, we see that this is nothing but a way of describing the mathematical theorems. So because he was a mathematician, because he had this idea and a background of mathematics, he formulates the same style while writing his book. And another important thing that he uses in his book is something which is repetition. So he believes that if you repeat a fact again and again in the book, the people will remember it well. So he uses the same thing of connecting one topic to the other by repeating it one after the other. Now we'll come to some of the places that he mentions in his book, Kitab al-Hind. So there are many which he talks about, but we'll only discuss some of them. So he starts with this place called as Somnath. Somnath, and I quote, he says that Somnath is a coastal temple in Western India. And he actually gives the position of this temple on the shore of the Arabian Sea. He says that this is the most important Hindu temple of his time. He gives a very interesting information about the idol of the Somnath temple also. So he talks about the famous Shiva Lingam, which attracted pilgrims from all over India. He talks that this was suspended in air without any support. He says that this place received the maximum amount of offerings and donations, and that is what led to the thriving of the temple. He talks about more than 5,000 Brahmins being there in the temple. He talks about great magnetic forces existing in the architecture of the temple. Although he does not say that it is scientifically proven that this is magnetic theory, but he says that the locals believe this. So he is also stating the legends that are going on in the area. He does not stop there. He talks about the Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni also attacking and invading Somnath. He goes on to talk about that the temple was destroyed, the idol was smashed into many, many pieces. He says that the Mahmud did not simply destroy the idol, but he actually scattered its fragments across various locations. And I quote, one part was thrown at the threshold of the great mosque in Ghazna, another was laid down before the entrance of the royal palace, and the rest was distributed among the principal mosques of Khurasan. However, Al-Biruni is very, very critical of the Sultan when he's saying this. So he says that this act was deeply symbolic and humiliating. It was to demonstrate Islamic supremacy and to eradicate the idol's religious and political power. Although he is in the service of Mahmud himself, he says that this is something that was wrong. He shouldn't have done this. He does not glorify the destruction of the temple in any manner. And he says that this is something that was a turning point in the religious system of India. And he actually marks that this was a tone of detachment that he saw among the Hindus for the first time with all the other people. And he also says, and I quote, that this deed inspired the Hindus with a most bitter aversion against the Muslims. So he is not just talking about his own period, but he's talking about the long-term reaction that this would have as an event. He's talking about the Somnath raid as one of the earliest descriptions of the raid at Somnath. And just to tell you something very interesting here, he never visited Somnath and he was not accompanying the Mahmud of Ghazni when the raid at Somnath happened. This is all the information that he gathered from the people around. And still it is extremely accurate. The other place that he mentions is Mathura. Now he does not call it Mathura by itself, but he calls it Muttara. So he says that this is a very sacred city, and he also gives the geography where it would have been existing. He talks about it being a very important place for Vaishnavism and Brahmanical scholarship. He himself also had visited Mathura. He says that this was the main center where Vishnu was worshipped in his form. He says that there is not one temple in Mathura, but many, many temples at Mathura. He had visited Mathura first, then he goes on to describe the invasion of Mathura that happened by Ghazni. So he says that he was present when this entire devastation happened. He says that the city of Mathura was so strong that it took several days for the Sultan himself to overcome it. But when the city fell, temples were razed and idols were shattered. The tone that he uses in when he writes about Mathura is clearly stating that he does not like the act. He is not glorifying the act at all. He also talks about the emotional and the cultural trauma that the population went through when all of this happened. And he also goes on to say that this was one of the great seat of learning that housed several Brahmin scholars and also several scholars of the Sanskrit language. But his tone when describing the raid at Mathura and the invasion at Mathura is very, very lamenting. What is also a very rich account which we see in his books, which is rarely seen in many other travelers' books, is that he gives one of the earliest descriptions of the Sharada Peeth in Kashmir. So he first starts with the genealogy of the Hindu Shahis in that area, in the Afghanistan area. Then he goes on to actually justify Kalhana's Rajtarangini by giving the record of the same genealogy of rulers that existed in the Kashmir region. He talks about all the different battles that were fought in Kashmir. So he says that, and I quote, the last king of this dynasty was Jaipal, who fought several battles with Mahmud. He was eventually defeated, captured, and ransomed himself. However, after this humiliation, he immolated himself on a pyre. But this account is very, very accurate because he, as I said, goes on to corroborate the numismatic and historical sources, which Kalhana's Rajatarangini also mentions. Now, Sharada Peeth was a very important center of learning somewhere between the 6th to the 12th century. It really prospered. It is also one of the holy places in Hinduism because it is believed that the right hand of Sati fell over here. Al-Biruni describes that this place had a wooden image of Sharada or Saraswati, and no other traveler apart from him mentions this. He himself had visited Kashmir, so we know that he is giving an accurate account, but he has given one of the earliest accounts of the Sharada Peeth. There are many other places that Al-Biruni did not visit, but he talks about these places in great detail. So we know that these places definitely existed, and we also know about how these places existed. So first he starts with the acknowledgement of the great existence of Buddhism in the country. He says that Buddhism was thriving over here at one time, and to refer to Buddhist monks, he uses the same term which was used by many people across the country at that time, which is shamana. So he talks about the ascetics. He talks about how Buddhists had very separate doctrines, rituals, monastic systems from the Vedic tradition. So here it is important to understand that he is using Vedic traditions for the other people. So when he says Hindus, it is definitely a geographical term and not a religious term. He goes on to talk about the entire decline that happened in terms of Buddhism. He talks about all the important regions which were once very, very important for Buddhists. He says that before he coming to India, the Buddhists had been in great numbers in the land, but now there are very few left in number. He also talks about many Buddhist centers of learning in Khorasan and Persia also, which had also been destroyed. He compares Buddhism with the Vedic practices, and he also gives the reasons for decline of Buddhism. That is, first, he talks about the internal sectorial divisions, external invasions, and the popularity of the Vedic cultures, which is what led to the decline of Buddhism. He talks about the great port of Sopara, which is in Maharashtra, north of Mumbai. You can see its location over here in the map. So he's talking about Sopara being a very important site of Buddhist learning. And he also talks about Sopara being a very, very important trade center. And we know that today that Sopara, yes, was a very important Buddhist as well as a trade center because of the presence of the Ashokan edict over there. So this is the Ashokan edict that was found at Sopara. It is there in the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangrahalaya Museum in Mumbai. This is the brick stupa that was found in Sopara, and it was excavated by Pandit Bhagwanlal Indraji, the first Indian-led excavation. And inside the stupa was found a stone casket, inside which was a bronze casket, inside which was a casket of copper, inside which was a casket of silver, inside which was a casket of glass, and finally a casket of gold, along with all these images of the Maitreya Buddha. So here we know that Al-Biruni is proven right of Sopara being a very, very important place. He calls Sopara as Supara in his books. Another important port that he talks about is the port of Chaul. The port of Chaul is in the south of Maharashtra. It's located very, very close to Alibag. And he talks about Chaul also being a very important trade center for the Arabs. Like all the other Arab travelers, he calls the place as Zemur or Semur, depending on how you read it. And today we know that, yes, Chaul was also a very important trade center and the presence of Buddhism in Chaul also. So these are the Hinglaj caves. And Hinglaj is a very important goddess who is found across all the trade routes. We find that there is a temple of Hinglaj Devi in Afghanistan, and also her temples are seen on all the important trade routes. So there's a temple of Hinglaj Mata in this place called as Chaul. And next, the temple by itself is housed inside a cave, which is originally a Buddhist cave. So this is the stupa which we see in the caves. There are many other cave complexes also in Chaul. So we definitely know that, yes, he is talking about the important trade centers of this region. Now, he has not visited both these places, but he has access to all those people who are coming to these places or who are trading with these places. So apart from that, he is also mentioning some of the other ports. So first, other ports that he talks about is in the Sindh region, wherein he is talking about the ports of Debal and Mansoura. He also talks about this port of Debal being very, very close to today's Karachi, and that it is a very important port in that region. He talks about some ports also in Gujarat, that around Somnath there are many, many other ports that are important. And he also talks about a very interesting route to come to India. So he suggests that there is a sea route connecting the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean, south of the mountains of the moon, is what he mentions. So that is how he wants to mention coming to India. He does not mention the names of the ports in the Malabar coast, but there are no names as such, but he definitely says that there are many ports on the Malabar coast, and they are very, very important for the trade in pepper and other spices. So although he doesn't mention them, but he is well aware of the trade going on over there. For Indian Ocean, he uses the word Al-Bahar Al-Hind. So that is the word that he is giving for the maritime zone around the Indian Ocean. He also has given a great detail about the geography of this region. How does one come? What are the monsoon winds? How do you navigate through the seas and all of that? Purely based on the mathematical and astronomical calculations. Then there are some other places also that he visits. The ones that we see in blue are the ones that he did not visit, but talks about them. And the ones that you see in red are the ones that he visited and therefore talks about them. So I'll just briefly tell some of them to you. First one that he talks about is Lahore, which he says that it was a very, very important region and there was a very strong Brahmanical presence in this region. The region that he talks about is the region of Multan. And he says that there was a huge sun temple which existed at one time in the Multan region. And it was a major pilgrimage site for the people of the Vedic tradition. Then he goes on to describe this place over here, which is Thaneshwar, present day Kurukshetra. So he says that Indian rituals over here are associated strongly with the geography. This region has a lot of rivers and also a lot of pilgrimage sites. The people here are associated with worshipping the sun and also the religious bathing according to the movements of the sun. Then we have already discussed what he talks about Mathura. He also talks about another region, which is Kannauj. So he mentions that Kannauj was one of the most important political centers, and that also had a very strong Brahmanical influence. And he mentions some of the important rulers that had existed before him in the Kannauj area. Especially he mentions the Rashtrakutas that had briefly ruled Kannauj at one time. He goes on to describe the region of Banaras or Varanasi. So he says that this was the main center of scriptural traditions, Sanskrit scholarship, and all the rituals thrived over here. He talks about the calendrical systems which were very different from all the other parts of the country which were used over here only. And he says that most of his informants who were in Ghazni came from this region. Apart from that, he also talks about Somnath, which we have already discussed. We have talked about Kashmir. He talks about Sindh in great detail. And again, he mentions about the strong Brahmanical traditions over there, the river systems, the Islamic governance that existed after the conquest, and also the dressing and marriage patterns of the people in Sindh. The southernmost that he goes when he talks about a region in detail is Tripuri in Madhya Pradesh. This is an area which he has not visited, but he talks about the rulers over here. So he talks about the Kalachuri dynasty, how important it was politically, what were the connections, and the historical chronology of the entire dynasty. Apart from that, he is only mentioning, as I said, the ports on the west coast of India. We'll briefly see what other things he talks about in his book. So he talks about the religion and the differences between the people of Hindus and the Muslims. So he says that these Hindu people, Hindu again being a geographical term, are different from the Muslims in every respect. First and foremost is the language. And he says these people speak a very, very different and a very complex language. There is one word which is used to explain 1,000 terms. So one term can mean 1,000 things depending on the context. And therefore, he says that it was very, very difficult for him to understand the language that these people speak. To quote him, he says, these people believe in nothing which we believe in. He also says that these people of Hindustan or Al-Hind avoided association with the outsiders, especially Muslims, whom they deemed as mlechas. Mlecha over here means impure. He says that the parents would actually scare their children with the names of Muslims who were considered as monstrous. He talks about all the invasions that Mahmud of Ghazni has done, and also talks about how bad they were and being very, very critical of Mahmud. Where he says that while all the other people are calling him the lion of the world, I really did not like what he has done in so many places of Hind. He talks about the brutality done in all of these invasions. He goes on to talk about the Hindu customs being very, very different. He talks about some very interesting customs, which I will just quote over here. First of all, he says that these people prefer to eat alone. He says that they consult the women in the house in serious matters. Another thing that he mentions is very interesting is that they always ask for permission to leave, but never ask for permission while entering a house. He says that these people view sneezing as a very bad omen. They don't like to sit cross-legged. He mentions that these people like to write titles at the end rather than writing them at the beginning. And he says that all of this is very different from what we believe. He says that these people also like to consume and believe that it is holy, which is the cow's urine. However, they abstain from eating the cow's meat. He says that the society is pluralistic in nature. They have various different sorts of beliefs when it comes to cosmology, to mathematics, to medicine. He appreciates the way that we look at the world. He says that India is completely different for his understanding. He's seeing it for the first time, and he is understanding it in a completely. It is difficult for him to understand this entire region. He goes on to appreciate the mathematics and arithmetic that is used by Indians, and he says that it is very, very advanced. He says that it is the Hindu system of mathematics that has influenced the Islamic arithmetic system. Further, he also talks about the astronomy and the sciences. He quotes the Indian astronomers like Brahmagupta and Varahamihira, and he says that their understanding was also very nice. However, some places we see that he is not very happy with the Indian astronomers, and he says although they are saying that these are scientific movements, somewhere or the other they are also associating it with divine phenomenon, which is something that he does not like. He goes on to talk about the Hindu laws, which are, he says that based on books, sacred books called as Smritis. He also quotes Manu at some places. He talks in detail about all the pilgrimage sites which are worshipped by the Hindus. He says like the Islamic people have Hajj. The Hindus also have pilgrimage sites which are very, very important and sacred to them. He talks about the caste system in great detail. So he talks about all the four varnas and the people who he calls as antyajas, who are outside the caste system. He talks about the interdining and intermarriage laws, which are not allowed outside your particular caste. He talks about the problems that he understands as pollution of castes when there is interdining or intermarriage happening. He talks about the guilds of different occupations. He talks about the people of lower caste living outside the towns. And he also talks about how people of the same castes stay together. So in this way, he's not just talking about the arithmetic or the mathematics or just the astronomy or scientific practices, but he's also talking about the ethnography of the region. And when he is describing all of that, as I said, the style is extremely, extremely impartial. He is just stating the facts that this is what is happening. This is what happens in Greece. This is what happens in the Islamic world, so that the people can understand, okay, how do you compare all of these practices? There's just some places that he actually criticizes the Indians. The first one, which I told you, is in terms of the astronomy. The second place where he really criticizes the Indians is that they do not maintain a sense of chronology. He says that after every 100 years, the Indians forget what happened 100 years ago and they start a new cycle of time. And which is why they don't know how to calculate the events. So they don't know how to keep time properly. And this is something that has really ruined their history, is something that he completely critiques the Indians for. So this is briefly about what he says in his book. However, if we see in his later life, after the death of Sultan Mahmud, this book came out. And everywhere when he talks about Sultan of Mahmud, he only uses the word Amir Mahmud. He does not talk about the Sultan in great details. Like usually when we see it in the context of India, when a official historian is writing a record, we see that he uses at least 10 to 15 birudas for the ruler. But here, he just uses the word Amir. Amir Sultan Mahmud, may God have mercy on him. That is what he states. That is the title that he uses for the Sultan. That's it. He never goes on to glorify the Sultan at any time. He also, many places, goes on to critique the Sultan when it comes to India. A new period of Al-Biruni's life started after the death of Sultan of Mahmud and when his son Masood came to power. So Biruni became a favorite of Sultan Masood, and we know that he wrote a book for Masood, which in English translates to the Canon of Masood. In Arabic, it is called as Al-Qanun al-Masoodi. So he's talking about Masood over here in great details, and he praises Masood a lot in this book. Although Masood was not as great as his father, he continued writing on several mathematical treatises. He talks about the theorem of sines, of spherical triangles, on astronomy, on different mathematical theories. And he also went on to write about medicine. Finally, we see that Al-Biruni became one of the most or the greatest scholars that Ghazni had seen for a very, very long time, and also somebody whom they respected for a very long time. He gained a lot of respect in the life of Masood as compared to what he had got in the life of Mahmud. Finally, we see that till the end of his life, till the age of 75, he was continuing with his work. The last of his work was on the last of his work was on pharmacology. And we see that on 11th December 1048, which translates to the second Rajab of 440 Al-Hijri, is when he died. But till the end of his life, we see that he was constantly writing all of these works. To quote him, he goes on to say that for me, these works are like the second children in my arms, like beads on my neck. I do not make the difference between my sons and them. What do we understand of all of this? How do we bring all of this together? So Al-Biruni did not just view India as a traveler who came to India. He was not writing a travelogue. Like today, if we travel to a particular place, we click pictures, we write about it on WhatsApp, on Instagram, and different forms of social media, on blogs, etc. He was not doing that. Second thing is that he was not writing a partial understanding. He was not using the Islamic lens to view a new world. No, and he was also giving comparisons at every place so that everybody could connect and understand this new world that he was talking about. So he knew about this world called India or Al-Hind. But he went on to understand this world by personally visiting it, by understanding it with a new outlook, and by allowing the waves of new culture to come to him. So as Mahatma Gandhi always said, that I would like the winds of different cultures to blow into my house, but I would not be blown away by any of them. So that is what Al-Biruni tried to do when he wrote about India. Today, there are multiple centers established across the world talking about Al-Biruni. This is the translation of Al-Biruni's work. There are 2 volumes titled Al-Biruni's India by Edward Sachau. And there are a lot of research centers established, especially the one in Vienna. So this is Al-Biruni, the stamp in his memory released by the Soviet Union. And with this, thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you so much for allowing me to bring into life a scholar who really appreciated India and valued it for what it was.
Thank you, Riddhi. That was a wonderful and informative talk. To moderate your question answer session, we have Rajgopal from Tamil Heritage Trust. Abi, you can start.
Yeah, thank you, Riddhi, for this fascinating session. I think it was riveting, and we can say this going by the number of questions on the chat box. I'll quickly run through the questions. There have been 7 to 8 questions. So the first question is from Raghunathan Madhavosi. So the question is, in his book, Biruni says that he is translating Euclid's elements into Sanskrit for his Indian friends. I wonder if he eventually finished the job and the translation has ever surfaced. That's his question.
So there are certain translations that he has done of other works. However, they are not kept in as a separate book, and we have not found all the translations, but some of them have been compiled and put together in one book.
The second question by Jayashree Anand. How do we know that Biruni's description of the raid on the Somnath temple was accurate?
The raid on the Somnath temple. Okay. So
Somnath temple.
Yeah. So
you said he didn't visit Somnath at all.
Yeah. So he was not present when the raid happened. But the way that he is describing the raid and the way that he's criticizing Ghazni, and so that is obvious that if he is getting patronized by the ruler of Ghazni, he would not have criticized him. But he is giving a very, very impartial view. And he clearly goes on to say that, this is what is legend when he talks about the Shivalingam. But he goes on to say that this is what Ghazni did, but I'm not happy with what he has done. And it is very contemporary to when Ghazni did it. So it is very close to what might have actually happened.
So he must have perhaps gleaned it from first-person accounts or whatever. Did he mention the sources by any chance?
So he mentions that there are a lot of people who are captured and brought to Ghazni who are telling him all of this.
Okay. All right. So the next question by Rashmita Pukhan. Ma'am, did Biruni's reliance on Sanskrit sources always gave him a correct understanding of Indian culture and society?
So as far as Indian languages are concerned, he was only well versed with Sanskrit and no other language. So whatever his informants told him and whatever he gathered from Sanskrit language is what he has brought about. Does not mean that there were no other things existing, but this is what he could get.
Oh, so he was not versed in other languages in vogue at that time.
Sanskrit not in Indian languages.
Not in any other Indian languages. Okay. Question from MGNGS. Biruni says that only he is correct than his predecessors in writing about doctrines of the Hind. Are there any records available now of those predecessors?
Yes, his predecessors' records. His predecessors' records are there. And he clearly states that, they have misunderstood India. They have not given a clear depiction. He is the one who is giving an impartial depiction.
Does he say why, or does he justify why he claims that?
Yeah, so he goes on to say that, these people have used their lens or their previous understanding to understand India. They did not understand it as a new country. So that is why it is not an impartial view.
Right. So 2 questions from RD. First question, how different was Islam in India of those days, different from the Islam he practiced? That was his first question. And then the second question, when he talks of 5,000 Brahmins in Somnath, was it accurate or was it hyperbole?
So it might be hyperbole because obviously they might not have counted. The people who told him about it might have not counted all of these Brahmins. But it tells you that yes, there was a sizable number. And yes, Somnath was a very great center of learning and as a religious center is what we know from other records also. And the other questions, sir, sorry, I missed it.
Islam in India, how different was the Islam in India from the Islam that they practiced? Biruni and his people from, whoever came from there.
So there were different forms of Islam that came to India. First were the Arab traders. So in south of India, we always see that these Arab traders, the Islamic traders, always traded with south and the west coast of India. We know that for sure. So some of them also settled back in India, and even today in Maharashtra per se, we have a community of these people who are called as the Konkani Muslims, who have been here in India, last documented since the 7th century. So they are the first, they are the earliest ones who come from Arab, and these ones come from the Turkish origin.
Okay, so there have been Muslim people before his time
Yes.
also.
But not as official authorities to come and rule over here.
Question from Rajini Devarajan. How did all his works survive over the years? We have lost so many of our texts to so many onslaught. Who preserved his writings?
So his writings were never brought in India originally. They were there in that region. They were there in Ghazni province. And since it was an official record written by a chronicler of the court, and as he himself, criticizes the Indians that these people don't write it. But there in Islamic traditions, it was a practice to chronicle whatever was happening in the court, whatever the court historian is writing, and also preserving that. Most of his works have been preserved in the British Library also.
He was also patronized by the kings at that time, so they themselves might have taken pains to preserve it.
Yes.
Right. Okay. MGNGS, another question. Please suggest good reading materials, books on Al-Biruni and his writings.
So the best book is Al-Biruni's India by Edward Sachau. And if you read it also, you'll understand the way that he quotes Vishnu Puran is like he knows it at the back of hand, and not just Vishnu Puran, all the other Indian sources.
Very nice. Varaha Mihra Goku's question. Did Al-Biruni write anything about the chemistry and metallurgy in India in those times? Perfumes, textile dyes, etc.
So he talks about them in sense of trade. And he talks about little about the metals which were used, but he does not mention the technology and all of that.
Okay. Dr. B.R. Gangadharaya, ma'am, you said he was always critical of Muhammad, but how did Muhammad tolerate it?
Book was released after the death of Mehmed.
Okay, all right. Prabhakarian, is there any reference about Fardausi by Al-Biruni?
About which book?
Firdausi.
Fardausi.
Firdausi. Yeah, so
Firdausi.
Firdausi was another person who was there in Mahmud's court, who has written the Shahnameh. So yes, there are references in Biruni's work about him. And yes, there is an English translation available of that book as well.
Yeah, so he himself has quoted, he wrote Shahnameh about Ghazni. So yeah,
Yes.
he was wondering, were they contemporaries?
Yeah, they were contemporaries.
Okay. I think that sums up all the questions on YouTube. I guess Badri has a few more questions. Do we have time, Badri, Gauri?
Yeah, we can go ahead. It's only 6:53. Definitely you have another. You can take another 10 minutes.
Yeah. Badri, over to you.
If he has passed on his questions to you, you can ask them.
Yeah, hold on. I think he posted in WhatsApp. Give me a minute, Riddhi. I'll read out Badri's questions.
Yes, sir.
So the first question from Badri. Al-Biruni came to India a few centuries after Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta. Yet we find that Al-Biruni has not fully grasped the entirety of their mathematics. It appears that Al-Biruni depended a lot on his informants to learn Indian content, even though he learned Sanskrit. So, do we have any scholarly account of Al-Biruni's understanding of Indian works and its shortcomings? First question from Badri.
Sir, should I answer that first or?
Yeah, please go ahead.
So, he actually was with his teacher in the beginning, as I said, with Nasur Mahmud, and both of them have written treatises on Indian system of mathematics. So he was well aware about Indian system of mathematics before he visited or even talked about India. So
Okay.
they have written books together on the Indian system and overall the world system of mathematics, even Greek.
Yeah, you made a passing reference about Varahamihira, Brahmagupta, etc. But
Yes.
did he call them out explicitly and talk about their works by
He
any
has
chance?
criticized Brahmagupta in some of his works.
Okay, clearly he has.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Okay. All right. So the next question, there is a criticism strongly put forward by Audrey Trushke that Hindus never even attempted to write about Islamic religion. But a contemporary to Al-Biruni, Buddhist text, for example, Kala Chakra Tantra, talks about Islam, but though very negatively. Does Al-Biruni know about this text? And has he mentioned anything about it?
No, he doesn't mention this text, but he just says that, Muslims are very different from the people of Al-Hind. They are nothing like us and we are nothing like them.
Okay. I think that wraps up all the questions. I had one question. So his initial learnings, were there some, what kind of schooling system or, how was the education system back in his home when he learned so many things, astronomy
So
or
we don't
mathematics?
know how he learned all of this. He's not
Hmm.
talking about that. He just says, I'm grateful to the king of Khwarazm and my teacher who helped me in learning all of this.
Okay.
He
Okay,
doesn't
so
talk about
not
his
much.
schooling.
Okay.
Yeah,
Another question I had.
I had a
Gauri,
small
quick
question to ask. Sorry. Yeah. See, you said he came with Ghazni on his invasions repeatedly. Did he go back? Like, was he traveling to and fro between Ghazni and India frequently?
Yes, yes.
So it's like he went back and wrote some stuff and maybe left it there and then came again like that?
Yes.
Which could also be one way that his writings were preserved. Like, you know.
Yes. And he was also collecting information from the people who were coming there. And he actually starts writing the book much before he has actually come to India because he has learned Sanskrit. He's training himself in the Indian books and all of that. So he has started writing even before he actually comes to India.
Okay.
One more question about the education system prevailing in India. I mean, you called it Al-Hind, right?
Yes.
So a couple of questions there. One is, the Al-Hind region. What is the region, that he refers to as Al-Hind? I mean, because there is this narrative that only the Britishers came and defined India as we know it today. So what was, Hind back then,
So
and how
Hind
was it
will be
defined?
south of the Hindu Kush mountains.
The region south of Hindu Kush?
Starting
Okay.
from the Indus River towards the Indus River, south of Indus River.
Right up to Choras.
Yes.
Right. Another question about the education system prevailing here. There is another narrative here that education was denied to most of the population here during those times. What was his observation then?
So he says that caste rules are very, very firm. He does not like the caste system, he says. And he goes on to say that, the people who are from the lower caste, they are not allowed to study. He also talks about marriages.
Okay.
And there's one reference, since you mentioned, he talks about, I don't know whether this was really prevalent because apart from Al-Biruni, nobody else has mentioned it. He says that the Brahmins are allowed to have 4 wives, Kshatriyas 3, this Vaishyas 2 and Shudras 1. So there's no other reference that I've come across apart from him say that. And I don't know how that is mathematically also calculated.
4, 3, 2, 1 system. Okay.
The more the merrier.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. Really fascinating. Over to you, Gauri and Badri.
Yeah, that was a wonderful talk, Riddhi. It was delightful and we gave a great insight into Al-Biruni. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Now, shall we move on to the second talk of the day, Badri? Badri, shall we?
Yeah, please go ahead, please.
The second talk of the day, once again, oh sorry, is to be given by Professor Max Deeg, Professor of Buddhist Studies at Cardiff University, Wales, UK. A warm welcome to you, Max. He will be talking about Xuanzang and his travels in India, and his talk is titled "The Chinese Monk Who Unlocked Buddhist India, Xuanzang and His Travels." in this talk, once again, the discovery and reconstruction of Indian Buddhism in the 19th century gained momentum with the translation into Western languages of the travelogues of Chinese monks who came to India between early 5th and 9th centuries. In his talk, Professor Max Deeg will introduce and focus on the most famous of these Chinese Buddhist pilgrims, Xuanzang, who traveled to India between 629 to 645 Common Era, and his record of the western regions of the Great Tang, known as the Datang Xiuji, in which the monk presents to the reader a wealth of information about 7th century India, particularly on Buddhism and Buddhist sites. Professor Deeg will be highlighting the impact of the record on South Asian archaeology and historical research and re-evaluate its value for the reconstruction of Buddhist history by presenting and discussing selected examples from the text. A little bit about the speaker. Professor Max Deeg is a professor in Buddhist studies at Cardiff University, Wales, and his main research area is the history of Buddhism with a focus on South Asia and China and the Buddhist interaction between these two regions. Professor Deeg is working on Xuanzang's travelogue, the record of the western regions of the Great Tang, and is preparing a multi-volume new translation and commentary of this text. Professor Deeg has been and is involved in the research project, the Xuanzang Trail, supported and funded by the Bihar Heritage Development Foundation, which traces and explores the Buddhist sites in Bihar mentioned in the record. Once again, a very warm welcome to you, Max. We are delighted to have you here. I'll stop sharing and you can take over the screen.
Okay, first of all, namaskar, everybody.
Thank you.
Should we first kind of share screen before I start? Just let me see. Ah, yeah, here it is.
Yeah.
Okay, now I have to, let me see. Just hang on. Ah, yeah. Is that visible?
Yeah. Yeah, fine. Yeah.
And you can hear me clearly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, good. So thanks again for inviting me to give a talk on a topic that has been with me now for, I would say, more than 2.5 decades, maybe even before. So the title I've chosen, The Chinese Monk Who Unlocked Buddhist India, sounds a little bit spectacular, but I hope that by the end of the talk, you really have a feeling why I've chosen the title. So in a way, I could stop right here because Gary has already said pretty much everything I will touch upon in the talk, but well, I probably have a little bit more details to give. So in a way, it's structured along exactly these lines. I will introduce the Xuanzang and the text, so the record, as I call it, in an abbreviated form in order not to repeat all the time the Chinese title and the English translation. And then we'll have a look into the, I call it normally reception history. That means how the text actually came to the awareness of Western scholars at the very beginning in the 19th century, what kind of impact it had. Then I will turn to the more popular reception of the text in Asia, because of course the text before the 19th century has already a history in Asia, particularly in East Asia, in China, Japan, and Korea, mostly. And then we'll look into a couple of examples as far as I have some time left, which will discuss the questions of historical reliability, about what we can extract from the text in terms of archaeology. So I will be talking a little bit more about the things that the first talk on the Chinese Buddhist travelers on Faxian, I think 2 days ago or 1 day ago, by Dr. Jain actually has already mentioned. So this is probably on the left-hand side, left-hand side from your side as well, the most well-known iconographic form of Xuanzang. You can see him with his, for me at least, a little bit ridiculous kind of thing on his back, where you can see here little dots, which are supposed to be the sutra scrolls that he brings back from India. Of course, already, if you like, a anachronism, because of course he did not bring scrolls. He brought back Bodhi manuscripts from India, palm leaves manuscripts in most cases, with the lamp in front of him, dangling in front of him. So that is a Japanese, relatively late medieval iconography that has made it into our recollection of the famous Chinese monk who had stayed in India for quite a long time. On the right-hand side, you can see already a kind of reception history. Xuanzang, of course, made it into the Indian mind, at least through a little booklet in the series Amar Chitrakatha, where you see here a scene that is not taken from the record I will be talking about, but from the biography, by one of Xuanzang's biography. I will talk about these a little bit later, where a scene is depicted where the biography says that Xuanzang was captured by followers of Durga, and they wanted to sacrifice him, so human sacrifice. And Xuanzang said, "Well, wait a moment. Let me first make a prayer, and then I'm ready to die." So he prayed to Maitreya, and wait a moment, no, I think it was Avalokiteshvara, and immediately a thunderstorm came up. The robbers, of course, were fully frightened and became Buddhists and released the monk. So one of these dramatic episodes in the biography, which, as I said, are of course not contained in the record, which is my main concern in this talk. Now, before we jump to the 7th century, that is the time of Xuanzang, it's probably important to give you a little bit more context about these Chinese Buddhist travelers, because Xuanzang, of course, was not the first and the only one. You've already heard about his predecessor in Dr. Jain's talk, Faxian, but even before Faxian, there were others. The earliest evidence we have in Chinese texts, in Chinese literatures, actually is of a monk called Zhu Shixing, who in the 3rd century made the journey through the Taklamakan desert. We heard about that again in Dr. Jain's talk, and wanted to go and get a manuscript, a complete manuscript of the so-called Prajnaparamita Sutra, which was not fully available in Chinese. He did not make it to India, however. He found what he wanted to have in Khotan already, so at the southwestern corner of the Taklamakan desert, just before crossing the mountains into India, and that was enough, so he returned. But there were other monks going as well, around the time in which Faxian traveled, who, as we heard, traveled between 399 and 412. And left us the first complete record that has survived. There were others by other monks in that period, around that time, but all these texts have not survived. The only one that has survived and is the first complete record is Faxian's Foguoji, the record of the Buddhist kingdoms, which is also known as the Gaosen Faxian Zhuan, the biography of the eminent monk Faxian. So we've heard about him, so I don't go into details, just a couple of pictures and maps. So this is an interesting British conception of Faxian's visit to India. So you can, it's from Hutchins' Story of the Nations, a kind of encyclopedic history for educated people, published here in don't know which edition that is, but in London, 1933. So you get a picture of Fa Xian standing here, according to the description, looking at the ruins of Ashoka's palace in Pataliputra. Now, if you know a little bit about Indian architecture, Indian Buddhist architecture, you probably realize that this has nothing to do with Pataliputra, but that the painter or the drawer quite has taken the liberty to actually take some motive from the stupa at Barhut and of Sanchi to create an Indian impression. So what you see is that the monk looks quite old. That is this idea that he went to India when he was already at the age of 60, which is a which is a date that I would contest. I think he was much younger when he went. It's a misunderstanding of the textual tradition. Again, we have Fa Xian entering the Chitrakatha world. So you can see him as a, again, relatively old monk trying to cross the Indus River. There is also a so-called real Fa Xian. A couple of years ago, a wall painting was discovered in Western China in one of the many cave temples preserved there, the Binglingsi in Gansu, in the Gansu corridor, which is actually the gateway into Central Asia when you travel overland to India. So in that monastery, in that cave monastery, they found a wall painting, which in the cartouche quite clearly has the name of Fa Xian, Gong Yang. So Fa Xian actually making offerings. So he looks like almost like a foreigner, not like a Chinese. But at least it shows that at a relatively early period in time, people were aware of Fa Xian as a famous traveler. So we already learned from Dr. Jain that Fa Xian's route actually was going to India overland. So he went from the capital, Chinese capital of Chang'an, all the way through Central Asia, the Taklamakan Desert, crossed the mountains and went into Central India, where he stayed some time, then went down to Sri Lanka, stayed there for another 2 years, and then took the quite dangerous sea route back via Southeast Asia, and then up back to China. So a full circle, if you like. And he's the only one who did that, actually. All the others either went by land route and came back, as our example today, Xuanzang, or they came by the sea route, as another one, which I will introduce, Yijing. So this is all about giving you a little bit of the sequence of these Chinese travelers who left us records about their journeys and about Buddhist India. So this is the one I will be talking most of the time in this talk, Xuanzang. We don't know exactly his biographical dates. So 603 to 664. He didn't get very old, as you can see, maybe because he was quite exhausted after the long journey. Another date for the birth is 600. So the Chinese sources actually create this kind of confusion. So the texts which are related to Xuanzang, or let's say the textual basis for studying Xuanzang and his biography, and of course then also including his travels to India and his stay in India, are quite broad. So we have much more about this monk than we have about the others. So we have his so-called autograph, so the record he left about his travels, the Da Tang Xi Ji, the record of the western regions of the great Tang dynasty, which was compiled between 645, the year he came back to China, and 646. And it's very important to state that this text was commissioned, ordered by the second emperor of the Tang dynasty, Taizong, who obviously wanted to get, to take advantage of the knowledge that the monk had amassed on the so-called Western regions, which was pretty much everything west of the Chinese border, including even the region south, which is India. We have then in total 3 different biographies of Xuanzang. We have a very long one, the longest that any pre-modern Chinese monk ever got, by one of his disciples, Hui Li, and a little bit later expanded, a couple of decades later, expanded by another monk, Yan Cong. This is a biography with a impossible long title, 大唐大慈恩寺三藏法师传, the biography of the Tripitaka Dharma master of the great Tzu-en monastery, that was the monastery in which he was housed for most of the time after coming back, of the great Tang. This is the biography which is used in most cases when people actually talk about Xuanzang or when they actually write about him. There is another one by another collaborator of Xuanzang, which is much earlier and therefore doesn't cover the whole biography. So it includes the travel to India, which is found in a collection of biographies of eminent monks by the monk Dao Xuan, the Xu Gaozhen Zhuan. Then there's another one written as a posthumous brief biography of the deceased Tripitaka master Xuanzang of the Great Tang by an otherwise unknown Chinese monk, Ming Xiang. There are some references in non-Buddhist texts. The most, well, not really long one, but at least giving us some details, is found in the older history of the Great Tang, which was compiled quite couple of centuries later, in 945, the Jiu Tang Shu. So in the chapter 191, we find a very short, brief biographical notice about Xuanzang. Now, the geographical situation. So I did not include here the upper part, which would be somewhere here. So the start somewhere in China over here in Chang'an, the so-called Western capital, because China at that time had two capitals, an eastern and a western capital. And then through Central Asia into India, what you see, it starts here when he was crossing the Pamir Mountains, here going into Tokharistan, Tukhara, then into what is nowadays Afghanistan. So here he follows more or less Faxian's route, not exactly, but then ending up in the first region people would arrive in when they entered India through the mountain passes, that is Gandhara. We heard about that already in Dr. Jain's talk. And then making his way all the way down into central India. That, of course, was his aim. So the region which is in the Indian text called Magadha, so the area where the historical Buddha Gautama Siddhartha actually was roaming around with all the important sites that were linked to the biography of the Buddha. And then, of course, he learned for a couple of years in that region, in different monasteries, mostly at the Nalanda Mahavihara, which at that time was already full-fledged in full blossom. So we heard about Faxian that his incentive to go was to retrieve texts and Buddhist teachings. In his case, in Faxian's case, these were Vinaya texts, so he was interested in the monastic code. Xuanzang now had a slightly different interest. His foremost interest was in Yogacara philosophy, so the new kind of Buddhist idealistic philosophical system, to study that and to bring back texts to China. But that was not the only interest. He also was interested very much in all kind of Mahayana texts. So the Prajnaparamita Sutra was the longest text, actually, was very much in his focus, and also a lot of Abhidharma texts. Abhidharma Kosha, for instance, was translated by Xuanzang into Chinese after his return. So some notes on the map. So you have here on this map I've chosen a green line, which seems to indicate that this was his travel route. Now, this has to be taken with a grain of salt, because in some cases we are actually not sure that Xuanzang really visited all the places he describes in the record. In some cases, we actually know exactly that he did not go to these places. For instance, you see Down here, Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka, which was visited by Faxian, by his predecessor, was never visited by Xuanzang. He tells us that he wanted to go, but that there was trouble in Sri Lanka and he couldn't go. That didn't hinder him, however, to give us a very long and detailed description of Sri Lanka and its Buddhism, which probably was taken up by hearsay. To round up the picture of these Chinese monks going to India, because there were several kind of waves of monks who traveled in that period. The Tang period, so that period around the 7th century into the 8th century, certainly the most vivid period of traveling, in which also this person here traveled. I Ching, there is no iconological kind of depiction of I Ching, so I've taken the liberty to just take a random picture which some modern painter imagines how I Ching looked like. Now, I Ching's travel, as you can see, started by sea, so he went down all the way to Sumatra, to what was at that time the kingdom of Sri Vijaya. We heard about that already in Dr. Jain's talk. And then on the sea route again, all the way to Tamralipti, to the Gangetic, to the mouth of the Ganga, and then to a relatively restricted area. You can see this is probably mostly Magadha. So that's a Thai map. So I can't read that one, but I clearly know where the dots actually are, what they mean. So it's again Bodh Gaya, it is Nalanda University, Nalanda Mahavihara, where he studied, and the other important Buddhist sites in Magadha. This guy left us 2 works which are not really travelogues as such, no pilgrim records, as it's very often said. So one text is the record of the inner Dharma, that means, of course, Buddhism, sent back to China from the Southern Sea. So that was a work that he composed, or that he compiled, in which he describes monastic life and customs in India and in Southeast Asia. Which is quite understandable, because I Ching also was very much interested in monastic codes, particularly in the monastic code of the Mulasavastivadin Vinaya, which was obviously practiced at Nalanda at that time. And that was the monastic code that he brought back to China and translated. Very voluminous Vinaya indeed. So in a way, what is found here in that record is a kind of a practical translation of Vinaya rules into how Buddhist monks actually practice Buddhism, with some add-ons about the actual monastic life in India. Then another interesting text was written by him, or compiled by him, which is the biographies of eminent monks searching the Dharma, looking for the Dharma of the Great Tang. So that is a collection of 80-odd biographies of monks who, between Xuanzang's travel, which ended 645, and I Ching's own travel to India, had traveled to India, and either stayed there, some of them stayed in India, obviously, and some moved back to China. So it is a testimony of a quite vivid travel activity between China and India at that time. One of the most important pilgrimage places, of course, not only for these Chinese monks, but for Buddhist travelers in general, was the place of enlightenment, Bodh Gaya. And I'm showing you this picture not only because I wanted to show you Bodh Gaya, which you probably know as well as I do, or even better, but also the fact that Bodh Gaya was the aim for Chinese Buddhist pilgrims to India over the centuries. So we have from Bodh Gaya, from the early excavations, I will return to that in a moment. From the early excavations at Bodh Gaya, we have actually some specimens of Chinese inscriptions that were detected there. And these inscriptions, Chinese inscriptions from Bodh Gaya, actually, which are always a blend between, as you can see, Indian iconography. So you have here the Buddha sitting in the middle. So the Buddha in earth-touching gesture, quite appropriate for Bodh Gaya, because that's of course what he does when he tries to defeat Mars as well. The earth is my witness. And here two deities flanking. And of course, the text then completely Chinese. Another one here. So you see here 7 Buddhas of the past. So Siddhartha, Gautama being this one, the last one, and then Maitreya here at the very end. So the typical 7 Buddhas of the past. And another Chinese inscription here from the 12th century. Now, before I go to the text itself, I would like to tell you a little bit about the reception history, as I've already announced. So we have to jump back into the 19th century. At the beginning of the 19th century, the British, of course, were already establishing their empire, not only in South Asia, but also around the globe. There was a stream, or had already been a stream of information about Buddhism. The problem was that people didn't realize that all these different forms of a religion that we nowadays call Buddhism actually were the same religion, Buddhism. So there were reports from Tibet, there were reports from China, from Thailand, and other places, from Sri Lanka, from Ceylon. But people had difficulties to see, Europeans had difficulties to see that this all was referring, these reports were referring to the same religion. So that changed in the 19th century when scholars started not only to study Indic texts of Buddhist provenance, for instance, the Pali texts from the Theravada tradition in Sri Lanka, which at that time became more and more, of course, colonized by the British, but also by an emerging, as you could say, scientific sinology. So the study of Westerners of Chinese texts. And the first texts, some of the first texts that the Europeans studied of Chinese historical texts actually were Buddhist. And the first text that was really fully translated and commented on, which was not Confucian, so not kind of typical Chinese, was a Buddhist text, and a text that we already know, that was the travel record of Faxian, which was first translated into French in the year 1836 by the first professor of Chinese language or of sinology, by Abel Remisa in Paris. So quite a handsome guy, as you can see. Unfortunately didn't get very old, but at least had enough time to translate for the first time one of these Chinese travelogues. He was followed then by his successor on the chair of sinology in Paris, Stanislas Julien, who then one after the other translated the Xuanzang texts, the most important ones, into French. So the first one being The Life. The reason is quite easy, because he had a copy of it, because there were no complete Buddhist scriptures at that time in Europe. People were actually relying on what they were sent from China. So the first one was the biography of Xuanzang, also because, of course, it was a much shorter text than what followed in 1857-58 in 2 volumes. The first translation of Xuanzang's record, the Da Tang Xi Qi, into Western language, into French. So stay aware that this was for quite some time, until Samuel Beal in 1869 translated the text by the travelogue by Faxian and another one by Sung Yun into English. That was for a long time the only translation of the Da Tang Xi Qi that was available for quite a while. This has an impact on actually how archaeologists in India, British archaeologists, actually dealt with the text, because they didn't have an English translation at the beginning. They had to work with the French. So British at that time still could read French, quite astonishingly. So that's Stanislas Julien, the translator of Xuanzang's text. So shown a little bit older, but certainly not as handsome as his predecessors. So in 1884, Samuel Beal, the same guy that we already encountered, translated the Datang Xi Qi, the Buddhist records of the Western world, into English. So from that period onwards, people mostly used this version. Although I have to say, in comparison, Samuel Beale's translation is not better. I would even say in some perspectives is less better than the French, the earlier French one. So there's another kind of sequence of how these texts were translated. We heard about James Legge, an Oxford professor who normally didn't touch Buddhist texts in Chinese, but dealt mostly with Confucian texts. But as an exception, he translated as well Faxian's travelogue, so the earlier one. The reason that you have quite a lot of English translations or Western translations of Faxian's record in comparison with Xuanzang's text is quite easy, because Faxian's text is much shorter than Xuanzang. I made a calculation before I came in. So Faxian's record consists of 15,700 characters, Chinese characters, 15,700, while Xuanzang's text, which has 12 fascicles or volumes, consists of 128,000 characters. So it's almost the double. That's also the reason that, of course, it is mostly best known and mostly used, because it is much more detailed than the earlier text. So the reception of these texts in the 19th century by Indologists was quite mixed. At the very beginning, when the first translations in French actually were published, Sanskritists were quite reluctant to accept that they had something in their hand which was usable for the reconstruction of Indian history. That changed over time, and as an example, I give you a statement by Christian Lassen, the Norwegian Sanskritist on the first Sanskrit chair in Germany in Bonn, who wrote a multi-volume kind of overview of classical India, so-called Indian antiquities, Indische Altertumskunde. This is a quote from one of the volumes where he talks about the Chinese pilgrims. So he says, unequally more qualified than the Greek sources. What he means, of course, are the Greek sources like Megasthenes, we heard about that, and the other Greek sources that are talking about Alexander's trial at conquest of India. So equally more qualified than the Greek sources too. And now I can't read what is there, because let me just try to get rid of this. No, this does exactly the opposite. Yes. To write authentic reports about India were the Chinese Buddhists who visited the home country of the founder of their religion and the sites sanctified by his deeds, who collected the sacred scriptures of the creed and wrote down their observations after their return to their home country. Xuanzang's report is a pleasant contrast to the quality of the Indian sources, which are restricted to give dry facts like the succession of rulers, that's of course the Puranas, sacrifices, donations of land, inscriptions, and general statements about victories and eulogies on the rulers and their ancestors. So quite a praise on the historiographical value of the Chinese pilgrim records, and certainly not without reason. I show you again the map of Xuanzang's travel, or of the places that are described, and we will be concentrating now on the, let's say, the Gangetic Plain mostly. The texts, one could say, but particularly Xuanzang's travelogue, had an immediate impact on the investigation through British colonial officers and officials of the Indian past, particularly on the emerging Indian archaeology. The beacon of that archaeology in the 19th century is quite clearly Alexander Cunningham, a civil engineer in the colonial British Army, who turned into a veritable archaeologist. And he literally, with Xuanzang's text in his hand, first the French translation and later the English translation by Beale, raided northern India, particularly the Gangetic Plain, to find the places which are described in the text. And that was possible because the texts, the Chinese texts, actually give us things like directions, distances, although they are not always accurate. At least they were good enough, actually, to lead Cunningham to the most venerated, in the past at least, most venerated Buddhist places. So sacred geography of Buddhism was in a way unlocked by Xuanzang's text. So Cunningham went so far to suggest to the colonial government in India to professionalize Indian archaeology. And this is what he wrote to the Governor General of India, Lord Canning, in 1861, in order to ask him to establish the Archaeological Survey of India, or what became the Archaeological Survey of India. So, quote, in describing the ancient geography of India, the elder Pliny, for the sake of clearness, follows the footsteps of Alexander the Great. For a similar reason, in the present proposed investigation, that is the archaeological exploration of northern India, I would follow the footsteps of the Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang, who in the 7th century of our era traversed India from west to east and back again for the purpose of visiting all the famous sites of Buddhist history and tradition. In the account of his travels, although the Buddhist remains are described in most detail with all their attendant legends and traditions, yet the number and appearance of the Brahmanical temples are also noted, and the travels of the Chinese pilgrim thus hold the same place in the history of India, which those of Pausanias hold in the history of Greek. Now, Pausanias is, of course, this very famous description of Greek temples in Greece by a late antique Greek author called Pausanias. So Cunningham is quite clever here by suggesting the foundation of the ASI through references to a classical tradition, so to the Greek tradition. Say we have here something in India which is comparable to what we have actually in the Mediterranean. And another, you may have heard that actually through when I read it out. Another trick in a way is that he says, well, this is not only about the recovering of Buddhist history. This guy also describes other monuments, the Brahmanical temples. Although, of course, in reality, there is not much in Xuanzang's travelogue about Hindu tradition. Now, this is a map which Cunningham has drawn in his Ancient Geography of India, which is more or less a result of his archaeological tours on the basis of Xuanzang's report. And you can see that quite clearly because on the map, all these lines are literally following Xuanzang's record. Now, as we heard, Cunningham was mostly concerned with the sacred land of Buddhism, that is with the Gangetic Plain. That is, again, all the places that are linked to the episodes in the life of the Buddha. So the 4 major places: the place of birth in Lumbini, the place of enlightenment in Bodh Gaya, the place of the first sermon in Varanasi or in Sarnath, and the place of his parinirvana in Kushinagara, and then the extended scheme of that with more places. And you see here a map of these places. So just a couple of pictures, what Cunningham discovered, actually not the first 2 slides or the first 2 pictures, which Cunningham never really identified. The birthplace of the Buddha on the left-hand side, Lumbini. You see quite, well, actually the Ashokan pillar, unfortunately, is not visible here, at least not directly. Should be actually on the other side here. And what has now been, don't take this politically now, the hometown of the Buddha, Kapilavastu, which is, as one of the candidates, identified with a archaeological site called Tilorakot on the Nepalese side. Then, of course, Rajagriha or Rajgir, the famous Vulture Peak, on which the Buddha has delivered a lot of his sermons according to the Buddhist texts. Bodh Gaya, the temple, its very dilapidated, very early, late 19th century state before repair. Sarnath with the Dhammik Stupa on the left-hand side, and what has been identified with the Jetavana monastery, first big monastic site given to the Buddhist Sangha according to Buddhist tradition in Shravasti. Then Vaishali on the left-hand side, and Kushinagara on the right-hand side. So the unlocking of all these Buddhist sites, which had been forgotten for centuries in India, actually led literally to a kind of revival of Buddhism all across Asia. So to the kind of conceptualization of a Buddhist ecumeny, so an Asian Buddhist wider region. One of the most important supporters of that was the Sri Lankan Anagarika Dharmapala, who had kind of convinced himself that it was important to bring these Buddhist sites back into the control of the Buddhists. And one of his most beloved places, of course, was Bodh Gaya. I can see here Anagarika Dharmapala in front of the so-called Vajrasana, so the Mauryan stone slab, which is supposed to mark the place where the Buddha attained enlightenment. A very young Bodhi tree here on that side, which looks now, of course, much older, and a Japanese visitor standing here. So the life of Xuanzang, the kind of the adventures of Xuanzang, if you like, had a very strong impression on East Asian culture. So you can find Xuanzang in form of his biography, in some cases, of course, also of his record, in a plethora of different languages from different times. So here, for instance, you have an Uyghur translation of the biography of the Buddha from the late 12th century. So the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, in Western China, actually knew about him. This is a kind of a very abbreviated form of the Da Tang Xi Qi in Tibetan, which was compiled in the early 18th century. Pictorial depictions. This is from Dunhuang, from one of the caves in Dunhuang, which shows, we can identify that normally through the inscriptions in the cartouches here, which shows Xuanzang's return from India. So you can see Xuanzang on a horse. You can see the white elephant on which all the sutras and statues he wanted to bring back actually were transported. So this was still in Indian terrain, because we know from the biography that this elephant actually drowned in the Indus, and that a lot of the sutra scrolls and the statues were lost in the river. Maybe a reason for exploring the Indus and see if something can be found. The Japanese very quickly, of course, jumped on the famous pilgrim. So in the 13th century, they created a complete scroll with the life of Xuanzang, the Genjo Sanzoe. So here I have chosen a depiction from this 13th century Japanese picture scroll of deserted Kapilavastu. So that's Kapilavastu according to the Japanese imagination of the 13th century. In China, of course, Xuanzang has become an immortal through his role in a popular novel, which in the Ming dynasty in the late 16th century found its shape, which it still has nowadays, in the so-called Xi You Ji, not to be confused with Xuanzang Xi Yu Ji. So this Xi You Ji is a novel about the travels of Xuanzang, who in this work is called Tangsen, so the Tang monk. So you drop the name Tang monk, and everybody knows this is Xuanzang, who is in that novel accompanied by a couple of very strange creatures, the most famous one being the monkey king, as he's all sometimes called, Sun Wukong, who protects the pilgrim on his quite dangerous travel to India. So that is a kind of a imagined reformulation of Xuanzang's travels. Translated famously, or kind of abbreviated translation by Arthur Waley in Monkey 1942, through which it became very popular. It also had political ramifications in the 19th century. It was, for instance, Xuanzang was the icon of Indian-Chinese friendship when it was still flowering and blossoming. So this is a picture from the Buddha Jayanti, so from the 2500th birthday of the Buddha at Nalanda, where the Dalai Lama, as a representative of the communist Chinese regime, presents Jawaharlal Nehru with the skull relic of Xuanzang. It is still in India, but not enshrined in what later became the Xuanzang Memorial Hall near Nalanda, the archaeological site of Nalanda University. So you see here the Chinese building, which is very close to the archaeological site of Nalanda Mahavihara, with a typical statue of Xuanzang in front of it. The relic actually was given to Nehru was actually taken from another sample of relics, which is still in China, which is enshrined in Xi'an, the former Chinese capital of Chang'an. In Japan, Xuanzang has become the protector of security in traffic. You can imagine why that is, because he safely traveled over so many 10,000s of miles, and also as a guarantor, so sorry for the slip here, of academic success. Well, again, understandable, because he was the epigone of a learned monk for the East Asians. He's even venerated as a saint. So here you have a picture of a Xuanzang altar in the Genjo Inn, the Genjo cloister in the Yakushiji in Nara, in the ancient Japanese capital. He's also become, of course, a topic for a lot of popular renditions of his travels. So people actually who have tried to travel along his route have then written experience novels or travelogues. So I give you some examples from the recent past of these, or very popular kind of treatments of Xuanzang's travels, which mostly are relying on the biography and not so much on the more difficult autograph, the record, the Datang Xi, which is my particular topic. The recent past and political importance, well, September 2014, it looked very much as if Xuanzang could still become, again, a symbol for a friendship that lasted more than 1,000 years. But as we know, these are days of the past. The last kind of outcome of this period, very short period of friendship between the two politicians was actually this movie, 2016, Xuanzang as a Bollywood star. So that was started as a collaboration between India and China, and finally was finalized by the Chinese only. But the movie was actually filmed in India. In well, more than half of the movie actually plays in India. Now, let's go back to Xuanzang himself. So Xuanzang lived at the time of political changes. So the Tang dynasty had taken over from the previous Sui dynasty in the year 618. So Xuanzang at that time was, if we take 600 in this case as the date of birth, was 18 years old. And he left China in 629. In the third year of ruling of the second Tang Emperor Taizong, who ruled from 626 to his death in 649. As I said, the Datang Xi, the record actually was commissioned by this emperor after Xuanzang's return to China. So the political situation in China is quite clear. We have a lot, of course, of information from Chinese historiographical records about history in China. What we don't have so much, and you are probably aware of that quite clearly, is the same amount of historiographical material about India. Now, Xuanzang, of course, is kind of helping us to shed some light into this historical period in which he was traveling and when he was staying in India. Again, here the ruler at that time of North India was the famous Harsha Shiladitya, who of course also has an Amachitrakatha biography in which also Xuanzang plays a role. So I would like to actually show you by the example of Harsha and his empire, that was the ruler, as I said, who ruled northern India at the time of Xuanzang, what we can actually take from Xuanzang's record to look at Indian history. So this is a map, very schematic map of Harsha's empire. You see that's not exactly what, for instance, the Mauryans, what Ashoka actually controlled. It's pretty much the widest expansion. It's pretty much controlling the northern part of India, north of the Vindhya mountains. Here another map. But you see that, of course, the empire includes Magadha, so the place where all these famous Buddhist sites were and where also Xuanzang stayed at Nalanda Mahavihara. So what do we have about, let's first kind of look at what we have about Harsha from the Indian side. So we have, of course, quite a series of inscriptions. I will not go into details from different dates during his reign, from which we, of course, get the normal information about his succession line, his father, etc., etc. Is another copper plate grant of Harshavardhana from the Punjab from the year 8 or 33. A seal of Harshavardhana with the bull on top. We have, beside the inscriptions, beside the epigraphic material, we have 3 Sanskrit plays attributed to Harsha. We have the Ratnavali, the Brihadashika, and the Nagananda. And we have a Sanskrit prose biography of Harsha by Bana, his court poet, if you like, the so-called Harsha Charita. So we can actually reconstruct by these sources quite well, at least the skeleton of Harsha's reign. So he was the ruler, as I said, who ruled at the time of Xuanzang's stay. And of course, Xuanzang has to say something about Harsha. The only time actually in the record where the monk really acts instead of just describe in inverted comma from where to where he goes and what is to be seen there is actually when he encounters Harsha. So he has a dialogue, a conversation with Harsha that is recorded in the record, which is of course highly idealized. And it's also said in the biography that Harsha actually had high esteem for Xuanzang and actually even donated him a white elephant, which of course was supposed to be a great honor. So here we see again the Japanese 13th century depiction of a festival on the occasion of Buddha's descent from Triastrinsha, where you see King Harsha here, completely sinicized, of course, Xuanzang, the monk, and some other courtiers. So again, a depiction of how this looks in the imagination of this already seen early 20th century British illustrator. So Harsha here on that side, the monks, so 2 kings, somewhere the monk, and here the Buddha statue on top of another elephant. Now, according to the Xuanzang's description or report, Harshavardhana Shiladitya actually was the second in succession of the dynasty. So his father, Prabhagharavardhana, had an elder son, Rajyavardhana, who was killed, and then Harsha actually became king. So that is actually the succession line that we can extract from Xuanzang's record. So the Chinese text is very short, but is enough to reconstruct that lineage. Now, if we go to the inscriptions, where of course the dynastic lineage is given, and to Bana's Harsha Charita, we get a slightly different sequence. So we get much more predecessors. So it starts with the eponymic founder of the dynasty, Pushpabhuti, founder of the Pushpabhuti dynasty, and then has a series of rulers, and then becomes very concrete here 3 generations before Harsha's father, Naravardhana, Rajavardhana, the first, Adityavardhana, Prabhakaravardhana, the father of Harsha, and then what we have in Xuanzang. So in a way, this is a much longer lineage, as you would expect. Xuanzang only gives us this part, if you remember, right? So only these last 2 generations are kind of mapped by Xuanzang. Now, why is this? Why do we have, so is Xuanzang unreliable? Does he not really understand what was going on? It's been in India, in Harsha's empire for almost 12 years, and he doesn't know about the real history of the dynasty. Well, I mean, this is an example where you have to kind of read carefully the Chinese text and contextualize it. Why do we have such a shortened lineage of Harsha in Xuanzang's record? Well, this has to do with the Chinese situation. Remember that the emperor who commissioned the record, Xuanzang's record, Taizong, is the 2nd generation of rulers of the Tang dynasty. So he only has 1 predecessor in the lineage, in the imperial lineage. So Xuanzang could hardly actually portray an Indian dynasty which actually had a longer pedigree. So he quite clearly knew about the long pedigree, but he just didn't tell it to his emperor. He said, well, they have the same kind of constellation as you have. There's a little bit more in this whole kind of descriptions, but I cannot go into detail here. But this should be enough to actually show you how you have to read the text in order not to immediately dismiss Xuanzang as not being correct or not being complete. So I skip this one. Now, the interesting part for studying the history of India of the 7th century, maybe a little bit before and also afterwards, is that in these 12 chapters, in the 2nd chapter, Xuanzang gives us a very long general description of India along topics. So he starts, I've listed here all these kind of different topics. He starts with the names of India, the general geographical situation of the subcontinent, then measures of distance, measures of time, settlements and residences, outer appearance, clothes and adornments, hygiene and purity, of course, very important in relation to the caste system, the writing system, official documents, general education and knowledge, the 4 Vedas, teachers and scholars, Buddhist learning and Buddhist institutions, the caste system, the military systems. I was very tempted actually to pick up on the military system because Professor Trautmann, of course, in the context of Megasthenes, has talked about that. It would have been quite interesting to see how much continuity is there between Megasthenes and Xuanzang's description of the military system. The legal system, etiquette and behavior, illness and medical care, death and funerary customs, etc., etc. So you see, this is covering pretty much everything you want to know about a country or about a culture. And this is, of course, also what probably the Tang emperor was mostly interested in. He wanted to know, how does this polity called Hindu, called India, actually, how does that work? As a case study, I would like to bring you into the fold of something I've been involved in, the so-called Xuanzang project, which was already mentioned at the very beginning, which started in the year 2019 and is supported and funded by the Bihar Heritage Development Foundation. So the PIs on that project are Dr. Vijay Kumar Chowdhury, a field archaeologist in Patna. And he more or less chose me, selected me as his PI, who is, of course, then kind of responsible for the text. So the aims of this project is to kind of revisit Cunningham's endeavor to identify and verify or falsify or rediscover archaeological and topographical sites in Bihar, the previous Magadha, mentioned by Xuanzang in Xuanzang's text. It should actually lead to an adequate development of heritage awareness in the region and also to a certain infrastructure of pilgrimage tourism that does not only visit the most well-known places like Bodh Gaya, for instance. So the methodology is multidisciplinary, so it contextualizes the record, the text, and takes on board examination results from archaeology, from art history. It included and includes scientific specialists, so ground penetrating radar, where excavations are not possible, geographical information systems, satellite archaeology, remote sensing, all of this in one fold, under one fold, to actually explore the sites that are mentioned and described in Xuanzang's record. So this is my colleague and dear friend, Dr. Chowdhury, was the director of the Bihar, was the director of the Bihar Heritage Development Foundation, has a long career as a field archaeologist in Bihar because he was the former director of the K.B. Jayaswal Research Institute in Patna, and has published a couple of archaeological gazetteers of the Bihar state. So this is the Xuanzang trail team at stage 2020. That was just before COVID broke out, so we were kind of blocked by the COVID situation. What I want to show you actually is what you can squeeze out of the text. So we did several exploration tours in the context of this Xuanzang Trail project. So we explored Patna, the former Pataliputra, tried to make sense of the archaeological situation in relation to Xuanzang's description. We then went south towards Bodh Gaya, so you see Gaya marked. Then you see another site here, a very important monastic site, Telhara, which is referring to a archaeological site, a monastic site that Xuanzang calls Tailadaka Monastery, Tailadaka Mahavihara. And what I would like to talk about actually is a place in the middle that up to then has not really been taken account of. So when we actually had our 2020 tour and were on our way back to Patna, not very much satisfied with our results that day, we drove towards the west from the Barabar Hills with the famous Ashokan caves or Mauryan caves. And I saw this perspective, a beautiful image with the sunset, and you see a hill, a conical hill, with something on top which looks like a stupa. And I immediately was reminded of a passage in Xuanzang where he describes a miraculous mountain on top of which the Buddha allegedly had meditated. More than 90 miles southwest of Tailadaka Monastery, says the text, one arrives at a big mountain with one rock next to the other reaching up to the clouds, where spirits and immortals reside. Poisonous snakes and violent nagas gather in its caves. Fierce beasts and birds dwell in its forests. On the crest of the mountain is a huge boulder. Now, this is important. And on top of it is a stupa more than 10 feet high and marking the place where the Buddha entered contemplation. Formerly, when the Tathagata had subdued a local spirit and stayed there, he was sitting on this boulder, entered into the contemplation of extinction. That's the Nirodha Samadhi. And at that time, he spent the night there. All the gods and divine immortals made offerings to the Tathagata, played celestial music, and had celestial flowers rain down. When the Tathagata emerged from contemplation, all the gods felt grateful and built a stupa from jewels, gold, and silver. Now that the lifetime of the saint, of the Buddha, is already so far away, the jewels have turned into stone. Since ancient time until today, it is only when one looks at the high mountain from the distance that one sees the strange creatures. Together, like close relatives, huge snakes and fierce beasts circumambulate the stupa clockwise. Celestial immortals and divine saints follow each other according to their seniority to pay reference to the stupa. So you probably already kind of smell the red. The thing on top of this mountain is very much the stupa, which is mentioned in this this kind of short episode, which, by the way, is not known from other Buddhist texts. So it's one of these very regional legends that build up over time and ascribed a certain place to a visit of the Buddha. Now, when you go to the Kavadol Hill, to the base of the Kavadol Hill, you will immediately see that this had indeed a very deep historical meaning, because there is a Pala, man-high Pala Buddha sitting at the very basis of the mountain, probably in what was previously a monastic site. And you have also at the basis reliefs carved into the stone. So these are not only Buddhist deities, but also Hindu deities, which is interesting in relation to Xuanzang's record, because if you remember, he talks about deities that come and venerate the Buddha. Now, up to then, nobody really had explored the top. After we discovered this, we sent an exploration team on top of the hill, and they indeed found archaeological remains on top of the hill. So I only give you a picture of a couple of these remains. These are obviously bases of votive stupas, which have been erected by pilgrims on top of the mountain. So the archaeological evidence pretty much confirms what we suspected, that this actually has to be identified with this very short episode in Xuanzang's record. Now, to bring you to your own local or cultural environment, I would quite briefly give you another text bit, which is about Andhra. So about Andhra, Xuanzang says, I may go back actually to the map so that you see how far Xuanzang actually explores towards the south. So it's Kanchipura, which is the southernmost part, from which, he says, one can see Sri Lanka. I'm not sure about that, but you may be more informed about that. And then he turns west and goes up to Maharashtra. So we are somewhere here, right? So this is Andhra. And this is what he has to say. Of course, it's much longer. I just give you a part of it. The kingdom of Andhra, Andalwa in Chinese, has a circumference of more than 3,000 Chinese miles. The Chinese mile is about 420, 430 meters at that time. The great capital of the kingdom has a circumference of more than 20 miles and is called Vengira. That's, of course, already a Sanskritized reconstruction of the Chinese Pinchilor. The soil is fertile and farming produces generous harvests. The seasons are hot and the customs are fierce and violent. The words and the intonation of the language are different from those of Central India, but as for the script, the rules are generally the same. Think of the Tamil script. There are more than 20 monasteries and more than 3,000 monks. There are more than 30 Deva temples and a huge number of heretics. So this kind of formulaic sentence is normally how it describes other religious traditions at a certain place. Flanking the city of Vengira, not far away, is a big monastery with multi-storied pagodas and terraces and decorated with endless carvings. The divine appearance of the Buddha statues is as marvelous as a craftsman is able to conceive. In front of the monastery is a stone stupa, several hundred feet high and completely built by the Arhat Achala. In the language of the tongue of the Chinese, this means who is moved. So it's rather Achala. Going more than 20 miles from the monastery of the Arhat, who is moved towards the southwest, one arrives at a solitary mountain. On the mountain ridge is a stupa marking the place where the Bodhisattva Dignaga, in the language of the tongue, this means given by a child, wrote the treatise of the knowledge of causes. Going more than 1,000 miles from there in a southern direction through a forest wilderness, one arrives in the kingdom of Adana Kataka. That's, of course, Danya Kataka of the inscriptions, also called Great Andalwa, Great Andhra, Mahandra, in the region of South India. The kingdom of Dharmakataka has a circumference of more than 6,000 miles. Its great capital has a circumference of more than 40 miles. The land is fertile and farming is prosperous. There is a lot of wilderness and only a few settlements. The seasons are hot and the complexion of the people is slightly dark. Their character is fierce, but they are fond of learning and skill. Monasteries stand close to each other, but they are already neglected and in disrepair. Only a few more than 20 of them are preserved. There are more than 1,000 monks who mostly study the Dharma of the section of the great community that is the Mahasangika Nikaya. There are more than 100 Deva temples and the heretics are really numerous. So a short comparison between these two areas he describes are quite clear. In the northern part of Andhra, obviously Buddhism is still relatively strong. In the southern part of Andhra, as Xuanzang describes here, Buddhism is on the wane, it's in decline. So this is the map, and of course you can identify this Vengira, the reconstructed capital of northern Andhra, with the archaeological site of Vengi or Vengipura. So with this, I would like to stop. I think I'm already over time anyway, and am awaiting your questions. Thank you very much.
Just give us a minute. Arvi, can you come up? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Deeg. That was a wonderful lecture. We'll have Rajagopal from THD to moderate the question answer session. Over to you, Arvi.
Thank you, Gauri. Thank you, Professor Deeg, for taking us back along with Xuanzang on his travel. There are 7 to 8 questions. We'll quickly run them through one by one. First question by Rama Kalyani Venkatraman. How did Xuanzang compare the Hinduism and Buddhism prevailing in India during his time?
Well, as I said, you don't get very much about Hinduism from the Datang Shiji, as his predecessor Faxian, as Dr. Jain has already emphasized. Of course, his focus was completely on Buddhism. When he talks about, that's why one of the reasons that I gave you this description of Andhra is that you can see this formulaic structure of the text when he talks about a place he normally tells you about, as you may have discovered, and that is a constant kind of pattern. So he first describes the region as such, the geographical, topographical situation, so the extension of the country, the capital, the people, the character of the people, the products, the local products, and then he goes into telling you about Buddhism. He tells you about how many monks are there, how many monasteries. If he's more detailed, he tells you about the Nikaya affiliation, so the sectarian affiliation. And then he very briefly, in this kind of very formulaic sentence, says, and there are so and so many Deva temples and a lot of heretics. So the term in Chinese for heretics is Wai Dang, outside of the way. So they are outside of the correct tradition, which is Buddhism, of course. And you never really know what these heretics actually are, unless in some cases it becomes a little bit more specific and says, for instance, these are ash-smeared ascetics. Then, of course, you can read from that this is probably a Pashupata community. Or he speaks about the naked ascetics. Then you have to be careful. It could be Jains, it could be Digambaras, but it also could be some of the very extreme Hindu ascetics. So you really are not fully sure. You can do a kind of approximate relative comparison between what he says, like in the case of Andhra, when he says Northern Andhra has more Buddhists and the heretics are a little bit less. So if we move down to the south and we go to Greater Andhra, to Mahandra, then Buddhism is in decline and there are more temples and Deva temples and more heretics. So that you can kind of try to map. But you see, it's not very concrete. He's not going into details. In the biography, however, there are episodes where he engages in debates with Hindu, particularly Sankhya specialists. And he, of course, always wins, right?
Okay.
I mean, that's quite clear. He always wins. That's, of course, a very hagiographical description of a saint, a Buddhist saint who is superior and always kind of is on top of everything. So it's very kind of, unfortunately, very limited what you really can get out of the text about Hindus or Jains or...
Okay. All of them are heretics, according to him.
Sorry?
All of them are considered heretics in his view.
In his view, they're all heretics.
Right. Question by Anurag Count. If the speaker could throw some light on the text, I think you had already covered this in your talk, Journey to the West by Wu Cheng Yen, which is a fictionalized account of Xuanzang's journey to India. I think you did touch upon this, Professor.
If I put it brutally, I would say, except for Xuanzang, there is the figure of Xuanzang. There is not much Xuanzang in historical Xuanzang in the novel. That is a little bit brutal. Of course, there is developmental kind of structure, right? There is a kind of a leaning over time towards the biography first. So going away from the Datang Xiji, which is, of course, a very technical text. It doesn't really give you a nice narrative, no? Because it just says, go from west to east, 100 Chinese lees, and then you go there and all that kind of stuff. But the biography, of course, has all these episodes. From there, it becomes more and more fictive, right? So we have, for instance, from the 12th, 13th century, antecedents of the famous Ming novel, right? So the question, of course, people normally have is, how on earth does the monkey come into play? Where does the monkey come from? That is a very interesting question. There are all kinds of theories about that. Oh, it's Hanuman. Oh, it's this or that. I think the solution is much easier. I will not go into details. But anyway, so you can see with a few material you have that there is a development towards fictivity. And the Ming novel, the Journey to the West, is quite clearly the end point of that development, where Xuanzang actually becomes pretty passive. If it's not for his companions, for the monkey and for the pig and all these others, he will be killed immediately, because all these ghosts and monsters that are attacking, he has no clue. He's always wailing. I remember that my kids, because they grew up with a monkey story, and my son asked me, "Why are you interested, Dad, in this guy? He's such a wailing creature. He's always kind of complaining." So, well, the original one wasn't like that.
Nice. Question from Chakravarti Bharati. Did Xuanzang record meeting any of his contemporary Mahayana philosophers at Nalanda? Did he get a chance to meet Dharmakirti? And could you briefly explain what he said about his master, Shilabhadra? 3 questions. One,
well,
contemporary Mahayana. Yeah, go.
Yeah. So, I mean, the question answers gives already the answers in a way. So what he says about, well, again, we have to discern. It doesn't say much in the Datang Xiji about contemporaries, famous Indian monks. The only thing he mentions actually is the monastery of his master Shilabhadra. It doesn't speak about Shilabhadra in the Datang Xiji in the record. That all is in the biography. So if you want to have the exciting stories about people, and then you go to the biography. The Datang Xiji doesn't give you that. It gives you hints and little kind of pointers towards, for instance, Shilabhadra's monastery. Obviously, before he became abbot of Nalanda Mahavihara, he had been located in a small monastery a couple of kilometers or miles north of Nalanda. So you get information like that, but you never really get much about these personalities. Big mystery, Dharmakirti is not mentioned at all. That has puzzled a lot of the Buddhist scholars. They said, well, it's content is at the same time, so why did they never meet? I have no answer. I can't answer that. Maybe because
Sure.
Dharmakirti
So no
is
mention.
the amalgamation of a couple of personalities, is very often in Indian history of thought. So it's not only one. It's kind of, I have no answer to that, I'm afraid. But I only can say you don't look for any information in the text. There's nothing.
Moving on, Ramamurthy Shankar. Did Xuanzang write about Indian social structures, economy, customs, Hindu beliefs and customs, language, etc.? Perhaps he typed this question before your slides on these were presented. Maybe you can quickly respond to that.
Okay, I mean, I've probably answered already the question about about Hinduism. I've partly also answered, as you said, with the enumeration of all these kind of topics in the general description of India, a part of that question. And now what I would like to add is that, of course, kind of putting that into perspective, let's say, to pick up what Professor Trautmann discussed about the military. Of course, there's a section in that general description about the military. It is, of course, it's not real description. It is highly idealized, right? So it's highly idealized. I don't recall the details right now, but it says something about some of the soldiers actually are very well off. They are very well paid by the king, and they get land for their service and things like that. He talks, of course, about the fourfold army structure, despite the fact that at that time, of course, there were no war chariots anymore. But of course, that is what an Indian normative description of an army actually would present you. Go to the Arthashastra. It's exactly what is in the Arthashastra. So that obviously was kind of continued as a kind of idealized, idealized structure of the Indian army, of an Indian army. Now, there's another layer, which is the fact that, of course, the Datang Xi is primordially a Chinese text. So if you don't take the Chinese context into consideration, you very much fail with a lot of interpretations on the Indian side. To just give you one example, well, I gave you one example actually by the lineage of Harsha, right? This is the Chinese context which brings Xuanzang to present the lineage of the Pushpabhuti dynasty the way he does. Because he can't extend it. This would mean that he slaps his own emperor into the face. Say, look at the Indian king, he has a longer pedigree than you have. You can't do that. So there is some kind of political deliberation also coming at place. We heard about in Dr. Jain's talk about the legal system, right? That there was no killing. That, of course, is, as she pointed out, that is not confirmed by any of the Indian normative sources, nor by the Indian normative sources, nor what we know from other historical contexts. Of course, there was capital punishment. So why do they all claim that there was no capital punishment in India? Well, because it's the Buddhist land. You can't have idealized Buddhist, the homeland of the Buddha. You can't have capital punishment there. In Xuanzang's case, it's even more detailed. You can actually kind of bring that out of, work that out of the text, because he wants to show to his own emperor, this is how a good Buddhist king behaves. No capital punishment. None of these other cruel things that you are doing in China. This is Buddhist India. So there is a king who really rules like that. So he presents the legal system of India in a very specific way that is addressed and directed towards his own emperor. We can't read that as a description of the legal system in India in the 7th century.
Very interesting. Another very interesting question from Anurag Count. Did Xuanzang also act as an emissary between Harshavardhana and Kumar Bhaskar Varma, the king of Kamarupa? Could you please throw some light on Xuanzang's time in Kamarupa in today's northern India? That is.
I've partly answered the question by having pointed out that all these kind of encounters, blah blah blah, they are actually the encounter with the king of Kamarupa, with Kumara, actually is described. That's the second episode in Xuanzang's record where he actually is in conversation with somebody. So that's the two kings, the Harsha and Kumara, they are the ones where he becomes active in the text. The strange thing is now that the encounter with Kumara, Bhaskara Varman, is actually happening before the encounter with Harsha.
Oh.
And you can see when you compare both dialogues that the conversation with Harsha is an extended version of the one he has with Bhaskara Varman, with the ruler of Kamarupa. So you can't actually, you clearly see this is how to say, this is a poetic strategy. So he first talks to the minor king, has a similar conversation with him. So the king asks him about China and about the king there and these kind of things. And then he has a very similar, partly word by word conversation with Harsha, however expanded. So the relation with you have to go to the biography again. The only thing you can squeeze out for Kamarupa is the description of Kamarupa. And there he says quite clearly, okay, this is not a Buddhist country. So at least that's what he says. But if you expect more and say, well, please then talk about the Hinduism there, then nothing's coming.
Ramesh Gauri Raghavan asks, does Xuanzang talk of chess or of Harsha's biographer Bhanabhatta? Does Bhanabhatta mention him? The game of chess, and then biographer Bhanabhatta.
Does Bana mention Xuanzang?
Right.
No, unfortunately, the Indian sources are completely silent about these Chinese guys. I mean, in a way, you can't reproach them for that because they don't even talk about their own people. Why should they talk about foreigners? I mean, that's the problem with the Indian sources, right? I mean, they have a couple of figures which are important. Let's say Ashoka on the Buddhist side, and then a little bit about Kanishka and or Bana with his laudatory biography of Harsha, but so many other certainly important people which you grasp, for instance, in the epigraphy, in the inscriptions, right, in the copper plates and all these kings. That's pretty much everything you know about these guys because there is no historiographical writing. At least nothing has survived.
Right. Okay, couple of questions from Badri. First question, so you said Fahien came for Vinaya texts while Xuanzang was looking primarily to learn Yogacara texts. I wanted to ask this question yesterday itself, he says, but the speaker did not have much time. So why was Fahien so desperate for Vinaya texts? And when it comes to Xuanzang, what kind of continuous flow of Buddhist philosophical schools related information was floating into China, and why was he so focused on learning a specific school? A longish kind of question. Hope you got the essence of it.
Okay, the first question about Faxian's focus on Vinaya, that's a pretty easy one because at the time when Faxian actually went, there was no complete translation of any of the Nikaya Vinayas. So none of these Vinayas had been translated. Actually, one was translated when Faxian was away. The others were all translated relatively close after the return of Faxian to China. So he had clearly a point saying, well, if we want to be real Buddhists, real Buddhist monks, we have to follow the rules as they were laid down by the Buddha, and these rules, of course, are in the Vinaya. So how can a basic problem? How can you be a proper Buddhist monk when you don't even know what is in the Vinaya? You don't know how to do a proper pratimoksha. You don't know what the rules are about begging alms. You don't know all these things. They were not there. They weren't translated in Chinese. There was no complete Vinaya, and that was the drive behind it. That was a feeling that a lot of monks obviously shared at that time. We are talking about the second half of the 4th century. For instance, what I think was Fa Xian's teacher, the famous Dao An, has left us quite a little bit of writing, and he had the same concern. So he said, well, we got a problem here in China because we are not proper monks, because we don't have the full Vinaya. So in a very short period of time, when Fa Xian was away, 4 Nikaya Vinayas were brought to China and completely translated. So that shows you the urge of that movement. So that was the main concern, but not exclusively, because we know, for instance, from Fa Xian that he also brought back Abhidhamma texts. He brought back Nikaya texts, so Agama texts, so Sutra Pitaka, parts of the Sutra Pitaka, things like that as well. But the drive was the Vinaya. Now, when you go 230 years later, which is Xuanzang, then of course you have already all these Vinayas had been translated, so that there was no need for that. All the Agamas, Pali Nikaya, so the Sutra Pitaka had been translated already. Everything around the same time in the 5th century when Fa Xian traveled and was back in China. So there was no need for that. That was already available. There was a lot of Abhidhamma literature. There was a lot of Mahayana literature, which had been translated by, for instance, the famous Kumarajiva, who was mentioned, was it yesterday again? So these were available as well. But of course, there was constant flow of information by Central Asian and Indian monks about the developments of non-canonical literature, which was, of course, then the Shastra texts. So the texts that were dealing with philosophical problems, ontology, etc., etc. And there are several theories about how Xuanzang got to know about the Vijnanavada or the Yogacara. But obviously he got wind of it and he was appealed by it. That was his obsession in a way, right? So this idealistic philosophical thinking. But he was also interested in more mainstream stuff as well, as I said. So he was the translator of that Mahabharata Paramita Sutra, the longest Mahabharata Paramita we have. He translated a lot of Abhidhamma stuff, particularly Abhidhamma Kosha related, so the Mahayana kind of strand of Abhidhamma, which he partly picked up, obviously, in Kashmir, where the school was very strong. So he was in a way a polymath, quite clearly. In certain things he wasn't interested at all, but in other things, yeah. I don't know if that answers the question, but and you see, one generation later, I Ching again was interested in Vinaya, because obviously they heard that in Nalanda, in other monasteries, they have this very specific monastic lineage, the Murasavastivadin. Well, we don't have it in China, so we need it, because this seems to be the monastic tradition that was en vogue or was most perfect or whatsoever.
Okay, next question from Badri. So we learned that the main purpose of Xuanzang was to learn Buddhism. Okay, but do we find any writings of Xuanzang that talks about criticism of the prevailing Hindu philosophy, such as Upanishads, Brahma Sutras, etc.? And did the Chinese... sorry,
yeah.
Go ahead.
So nothing about the
Go ahead,
Chinese,
Professor.
except for these possible references to naked ascetics. And then, of course, you're asking yourself, why always naked? Why? I mean, must have been Shvetambaras as well. So, well, they are not described. But for the let's say the Hindu learning, right? The Hindu pool of knowledge, he is quite. I would say neutral to positive about the role that some of the Brahminical literature has in the educational system, and he actually describes that some of the Shastras, for instance, clearly from the Hindu context, what we now call Hindu context, were part of the Buddhist monastic curriculum. So they learned it. For instance, the more technical stuff like phonetics, then grammar. Of course, we know that there were Buddhist grammarians as well, but of course the basic is Panini, and he certainly wasn't Buddhist. So he describes in the general description educational system that this was part of the general educational curriculum, also in Buddhist monasteries. He even talks about the Veda, and he doesn't really dismiss it. It just is very neutral. It's a bit confused, the whole kind of description of the Veda, but he tries obviously very hard to give a kind of an objective description of the Veda, of the 4 sections of the Veda. As I said, a bit confused, but you can explain why it is confused.
Okay. The second part of his question, did the Chinese develop a critical approach of analyzing Confucian, Laotian, and other Chinese metaphysical systems in the light of the Buddhist logic and cosmology?
Oh, what can I say about that? There is not much in the record. There is, well, not directly. I mean, you have to understand how Chinese works, how classical Chinese works, even Buddhist Chinese. It is a constant referencing to the classics, and of course, the classics comprised the Confucian ones, so the Confucius writings, or the Lunü, the Mengzi, it's the Tao Te Ching, so the Zhuangzi. They are all part of the literary canon that also a Buddhist Chinese monk would have learned at some point, particularly when he grew up in a relatively well-off family. So they had this in their baggage, and writing relatively good classical Chinese meant that you have to take snippets, little bits and pieces from these classical texts. Yeah. So in a way, it's not only a good style of writing when you do that. So these references are there. He never really says, oh, but Confucius says, oh, and Lao Tzu has the following. That's not there. He's a Buddhist, so that he doesn't want to. In the biography, actually, when he is asked by the emperor, the son of Taizong, so the next one, the Gaozong, to come up with a translation of the Tao Te Ching into Sanskrit, he's very reluctant to do it. He does it because it's the emperor asking him, but he's very reluctant to do it. And of course, there are a lot of questions that, how did this Tao Te Ching in Sanskrit, how did that look like? That I have no idea. The text isn't preserved, so I have no idea how he translated that into. I'm certainly not reconstructing his translation into Sanskrit of the Tao Te Ching. The Tao Te Ching itself is already complicated enough. Now, if you do it in Sanskrit, oh my God. So yeah, there is, of course, again, this is the Chineseness of the text. I mean, my claim is that you understand the text only fully when you really make an effort to understand also these cross references. Because of course, when a passage from a classical text is used, at the same time, the whole kind of context from the classical text is implied in the usage of that word. It's a little bit like how to say, if you go to Sanskrit Kavya, if you don't have the full-fledged canon of Sanskrit literature, you're probably lost. You can't get any meaning out of that stuff.
Okay. There are a few more questions, Gauri, Professor. Do we have time to go through them? How are we on time, Gauri?
I'm with you.
Yeah.
Gauri, you're on mute. Please unmute, Gauri.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I think we can just wrap it up with a couple of more questions. Badri, what do you say?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
it's
So, Professor, if you're okay, I'll read out a few more. I think
Just couple
this
of them.
session has been so engaging. There are so many questions. I'll pick a few and quickly run them through.
Yeah, just a couple of them maybe, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So Ramesh Gauri Raghavan's question, another question. Did Xuanzang have a role in making the Dharmaguptaka Vinaya the default Vinaya in China?
I think there's a misunderstanding because, first of all, Xuanzang wasn't interested in Vinaya at all. I mean, he certainly knew the Vinaya because as a monk, he had to live according to the Vinaya, of course. I think that the Dharmagupta question is rather linked to a collaborator of Xuanzang. This is the guy who wrote the one of the biographies, Dao Xuan, who was the Chinese monk who introduced, who made, let's say, the Dharmagupta Vinaya the mainstream and finally the only Vinaya school in China. So if you have a Chinese Buddhist monastic nowadays, he's following the Dharmagupta Vinaya. That's probably where the question comes from, if I understand it correctly. And that goes back to a contemporary of Xuanzang, a collaborator who is almost as old as he is, so they live at the same time. And they know each other, but there is no Vinaya link on the Xuanzang side. It's all Dao Xuan, who wrote a lot of commentaries about the already in the 5th century translated Dharmagupta Vinaya, and then thereby establishes it as the Vinaya school in China.
Prabhakar's question, what were his references on Kanchipuram? And does he mention the king of Kanchipuram at the time?
He speaks about the Chalukyas, but I don't remember in detail, I have to be honest, what the Kanchipuram description contains. It's not very long, as far as I remember. I'm looking to my bookshelf to see if I can produce immediately, but it's not there. So the Kanchipura description is relatively short. And I don't remember if there's a king. I would have to revisit the text or my translation.
All right, let's wrap it up with Parvati Ravikumar's question. She says, I read somewhere that Xuanzang, when he embarked on the journey west, he actually escaped from the Tang kingdom because leaving the kingdom was prohibited. Does he mention this in his writings?
No. First of all, the Datang Shiqi, the record starts already on non-Chinese territory when it describes. So it's not actually describing the journey from the capital all the way to Western China and then crossing the border. He starts, and that's deliberate, because that's where the Xiyu, the Western regions, start at the time when he leaves. It's beyond the Chinese border, quite naturally and clearly. And that's also when he stops. So he stops exactly where the Chinese border is at the time when he returns, which is the southwest of the Taklamakan Desert, which is Khotan. So it's interesting that he actually uses both reference points and different timelines, right? So he leaves. At that time, the Tang Empire hasn't expanded to the west as it has when he returns. But he uses exactly the border points at the respective time where he starts and where he ends the text. Now, this whole thing about leaving the empire illegally, against a travel a travel regulation that or even a decline of the emperor to let him go. That is in the biography. That is hagiography. That is making the story interesting. I'm just writing at the moment, actually. I'm analyzing this a little bit more because I'm always annoyed about this story. Not about the story in itself, it's a good story. But I'm annoyed when people project this one-to-one into historical reality. Because if you analyze even the biography, you can clearly see that there are inconsistencies. So the narrator, the biographer, obviously is completely taken away by his urge to create a dramatic story. So Xuanzang actually leaving clandestinely the empire, then he's almost killed by a barbarian who is his guide, and then he passes the watchtowers, then they shoot arrows at him, and then they finally still. So it's a story that and it's inconsistent because the narrator once says, oh yeah, they wanted to have a travel permit. There were travel permits at that time. We don't know if monastics had to have travel permits. Merchants certainly had to have travel permits. But it doesn't say that he applied for a travel permit. It says he made a petition to the court. An unknown monk, 9 years old, makes a petition to the court. No, that's impossible. Then when he moves and he gets in trouble because he's illegally traveling, then it's not a petition anymore, a declined petition. Suddenly it's just a passport. But that, again, is not very, very convincing. Then the next step is then to make it dramatic again. One of the provincial governors actually has a warning, an arrest, a warrant for arrest. So that's completely dramatized. Nobody would care about such a monk who's just moving. Probably the reality is very kind of sober. He went from the capital to the west, and then he joined a caravan, as you would do, and then he actually went from point to point until he left China. And that's it. Not very dramatic, but most probable and most safe, I would say.
Thank you so very much. Very engaging. I think you took us back to those times along with Xuanzang. Thank you for this fascinating journey, Professor. Over to you, Gauri.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor. That was a wonderful, wonderful talk. We are really delighted and learned so much about Xuanzang and his travels. Thank you so much.
You are welcome. I enjoyed myself very much, as you could see, probably.
Yeah.
So thanks again for inviting me, and I probably should leave now, right?
Yeah, you can.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Yeah. Thanks to all of you who joined us today. It was really wonderful to have you here. Yeah. Thanks
to the audience.
Yeah.
3 or more hours. That is really, really, really perseverance.
Yeah. And for all those who missed the
So
talks,
many are still online. Yeah.
Yeah. For all those who missed our talks today, they'll be available at our YouTube channel at the link. Tomorrow, we have 2 more wonderful talks lined up for you. The first is to be delivered by Akshay Chavan, historian, anthropologist, and the founder editor of the Wealth Network. He will be talking about Ibn Battuta in his talk titled Ibn Battuta's Mirror to Medieval India. This will be followed by Namit Arora's talk on Marco Polo called Marco Polo's India, a 13th century view of the South. We hope to see all of you back tomorrow. Thank you for a wonderful time. Good night.